The centuries between roughly the year 1000 and the middle of the 13th century formed a remarkable turning point in European history. After the uncertainties of earlier ages, societies across the continent began to grow with new confidence. Villages expanded, towns multiplied, and political structures slowly became more stable. This era, later remembered as the High Middle Ages, stood between the formative early medieval world and the troubled centuries that would follow. One of the most striking changes of the period was the steady rise in population. More people meant more hands to work the land, and fields that had long lain empty were brought back into use. Forests were cut, marshes drained, and new settlements appeared in regions that had once returned to wilderness after the fall of Roman power. The countryside was transformed as farmers pushed beyond older frontiers, especially eastward into the lands beyond the Elbe, where German-speaking communities multiplied and reshaped the map of Central Europe. Economic life revived along with this demographic growth. Markets became busier, trade routes longer, and by the middle of the 13th century, parts of Europe enjoyed levels of prosperity that would not be matched again for hundreds of years. Cities attracted migrants from the countryside, beginning a slow movement that would change the balance between rural and urban life. Schools and centres of learning also reawakened, and the 12th century witnessed a cultural flowering that touched philosophy, science, and the arts. Northern Europe felt the influence of the Carolingian revival, which encouraged study and the preservation of knowledge. Out of this atmosphere, the first universities emerged in places such as Bologna, Paris, Oxford, and Salamanca. Scholars rediscovered ancient Greek thought through the works of Muslim and Jewish thinkers, and new systems of reasoning took shape. Great cathedrals rose in stone, their pointed arches and soaring towers expressing both faith and technical ambition. At the same time, the political landscape was being reshaped. The age of large barbarian migrations had ended, and new kingdoms sought clearer identities. In Scandinavia, the old Viking world slowly changed as Denmark, Norway, and Sweden adopted Christianity and joined the diplomacy of the continent. Raiding gave way to trade and state building, although struggles for power continued within and between these northern realms. To the south, the Iberian Peninsula was the scene of long conflict and coexistence. Christian kingdoms in the north gradually expanded at the expense of Muslim rulers, pushing the frontier southward over generations. In Italy, independent maritime cities such as Venice and Genoa grew wealthy through commerce with the eastern Mediterranean, becoming centres of finance and shipbuilding whose influence reached far beyond their walls. England and its neighbours also entered a new phase after the Norman conquest. A French-speaking elite governed the realm, new forms of administration were created, and the first assemblies that would later develop into Parliament appeared. Scotland and Wales experienced pressure from the stronger English crown, yet retained distinct traditions and periodic independence. Across the Channel, the lands that would become France and Germany emerged from the divided heritage of the old Carolingian Empire, each following its own path under powerful nobles and contested monarchs. Religious enthusiasm shaped much of public life. The Western Church reached an unprecedented height of authority and called for holy wars in the eastern Mediterranean. Armies from many lands travelled to fight the Seljuk Turks and established fragile crusader states along the Levantine coast. Similar campaigns were launched in the Baltic and Northern Europe, where pagan peoples were converted by force as well as persuasion. The Eastern Roman, or Byzantine, Empire still stood as a brilliant centre of culture, with Constantinople the largest city in Europe. Yet its strength was fading. New Balkan powers such as Serbia and Bulgaria challenged its borders, and in the early 13th century, Crusaders seized the imperial capital, creating a Latin kingdom that lasted for decades. Although the Byzantines later recovered their city, the empire never fully regained its former position. Beyond the Black Sea, another Christian realm reached its golden moment. Georgia, under energetic rulers, defeated invading Turks and expanded from the Caucasus toward the Caspian. Its queen Tamar presided over a flourishing court and strong army, turning the kingdom into a leading regional force until the sudden arrival of Mongol armies brought the era to an end. Intellectual life during these centuries blended many traditions. The ideas of Aristotle returned to Western Europe through Arabic translations, inspiring thinkers who sought to reconcile ancient philosophy with Christian belief. Scholars debated in the halls of the new universities, while artists covered church walls with vivid images and architects experimented with daring new forms. In many regions, local loyalties slowly evolved into a sense of shared identity that would one day resemble modern nations. Yet beneath the achievements lay fragile foundations. The very growth that had enriched Europe also made it vulnerable. When climate worsened and harvests failed at the opening of the 14th century, famine and disease spread quickly among crowded populations. The disasters that followed, including the Great Plague and endless wars, brought the High Middle Ages to a close. In the heart of medieval Europe, a new power rose along the Danube. The Hungarian kingdom, born at the turn of the first millennium, quickly became one of the most influential states between the Western and Eastern worlds. Its first crowned ruler, Stephen, reshaped the land with determination. He replaced the old tribal order with a Christian monarchy, encouraged settled life, and organized the realm into counties, modeled on the administrative systems of the West. Contemporary observers remembered him as a stern yet learned man who demanded discipline from his own people while welcoming strangers who sought a place within his borders. The kings who followed maintained close ties with Rome and presented themselves as defenders of the faith. Yet the kingdom also offered refuge to wandering steppe peoples, such as the Cumans, a policy that sometimes worried church leaders. Through dynastic marriages and military campaigns, Hungary extended its reach over Croatia and much of the Balkans, becoming a multi-ethnic empire whose royal house produced an unusual number of saints and revered figures. Farther to the north, another state was taking shape. Lithuania emerged from the forests and river valleys as a pagan power resistant to crusading armies. After the death of its first Christian king, the country became known as the Grand Duchy, and through rapid expansion eastward it turned into one of the largest realms on the continent. Poland, developing along its western frontier, eventually bound its fate to Lithuania through a series of unions that created a vast political partnership. The lands of southeastern Europe experienced more turbulent fortunes. The once mighty federation of Kievan Rus weakened, while nomadic Cumans dominated the steppe. Then, in the 13th century, the Mongol armies swept across the region, burning cities and forcing many principalities into submission. At the same time, the Byzantine Empire, under the energetic Komnenian dynasty, enjoyed a brief revival, only to see its authority crumble after a revolt in Bulgaria and the catastrophic capture of Constantinople by Crusaders in 1204. The Latin rulers who replaced the Greeks soon proved fragile, and new Balkan states filled the vacuum. Nature also shaped the age. A long interval of mild climate allowed grain to be grown far to the north, and vineyards to spread into regions that would later be too cold. With food more plentiful, populations increased and new towns appeared along rivers and crossroads. Improved ploughs, the wider use of horses and a three-field system transformed agriculture, while merchants organized the trade in wine and other goods. Yet prosperity remained fragile, and the Great Famine of the early 14th century showed how easily abundance could vanish. Within this changing world, the figure of the knight gained symbolic importance. Warfare became associated with ideals of loyalty, protection of the weak, and service to God. Heavy cavalry dominated the battlefields, and tournaments offered opportunities for fame and fortune. Monastic reformers promoted the idea of ethical combat and inspired the creation of religious orders devoted to both prayer and the sword. Noble titles gradually turned into hereditary privileges that defined social hierarchy. Religion lay at the centre of daily life, but unity was not assured. In the middle of the 11th century, the Christian world formally divided between Western and Eastern traditions, after mutual excommunications by Pope and Patriarch. The split deepened cultural differences that still echo today. Soon afterward, Western Europe launched a series of armed pilgrimages to recover Jerusalem from Muslim rule. These crusades reshaped the Mediterranean, creating short-lived Latin states and giving birth to military brotherhoods. Among these brotherhoods, the Templars became famous for guarding travellers and managing vast financial networks until the French crown destroyed them on accusations of heresy. The Hospitallers, originally caretakers of the sick, evolved into warrior monks who defended islands in the Eastern Sea. The Teutonic Knights carried the crusading spirit to the Baltic, conquering pagan Prussia and clashing with neighbouring Christian powers until their defeat at Grunwald broke their dominance. Intellectual life flourished alongside religious fervour. Thinkers rediscovered the logic of Aristotle through translations from the Islamic world and debated the relationship between faith and reason. Universities became arenas where masters argued about the nature of the soul and the existence of universal truths. Some emphasized experience and rational inquiry, while others warned against abandoning mystical tradition. Out of these discussions grew a complex movement, later called scholasticism, whose most celebrated voice was Thomas Aquinas. Monastic culture reached its peak during the same centuries. Older Benedictine houses were joined by the austere Cistercians, and charismatic figures such as Bernard of Clairvaux inspired renewal. In the 13th century, new mendicant communities appeared in the growing cities. Franciscans, Dominicans, Carmelites, and Augustinians preached among the poor and brought religious life into the streets, rather than the cloister. Not all believers accepted official teaching. As towns expanded and merchants gained influence, alternative spiritual movements spread, especially in southern France and northern Italy. The most notable were the Cathars, who preached a stark dualism between good and evil and rejected the wealth of the established church. Their popularity provoked harsh repression and a brutal crusade that devastated the region. Similar ideas circulated in the Balkans among the Bogomils, shaping local politics and even gaining royal support. In the later 12th century, a quiet merchant from Lyon changed the course of European religious life. Peter Waldo, after an intense spiritual awakening, abandoned his wealth and began to speak publicly about the message of the gospel. His followers, soon known as the Waldensians, insisted that Christian life should be measured only by the words of Scripture. Church authorities, uneasy with this challenge, forbade him to preach, yet he continued, convinced that conscience stood above command. By the end of the century, he was cast out of the official church, but the movement he inspired endured. The Waldensians criticized the comfortable lives of many priests and rejected practices such as the sale of forgiveness and the excessive cult of saints. Over time, their community spread across valleys and mountains, surviving persecution with remarkable resilience. Centuries later, when the Protestant Reformation shook Europe, their beliefs proved strikingly close to the new ideas coming from Geneva, and many Waldensians joined the wider Reformed tradition. Small churches that trace their roots to those early preachers can still be found on several continents. While spiritual debates divided societies, trade was binding them together. In the north, a network of seafaring towns formed an alliance to protect merchants and secure routes across the Baltic and North Sea. This association, later known as the Hanseatic League, linked cities such as Lübeck, Cologne, and Bremen with distant partners from Bruges to Gdansk and Novgorod. Warehouses and trading posts appeared along the coasts, and German settlers moved eastward into Prussia and Silesia, carrying language and customs with them. Curiosity about the wider world also grew. A Venetian traveller named Marco Polo crossed deserts and mountains to reach China and returned with stories that fired the European imagination. Missionaries and envoys soon followed, attempting to build bridges with the distant courts of Asia. Their journeys revealed how small the known world had been and how vast the horizons now appeared. Learning underwent a similar transformation. For generations, scholars in the West had possessed only fragments of ancient Greek thought, mostly in Latin translation. Contact with the Islamic and Byzantine worlds opened new doors. Libraries in Spain, Sicily, and the Eastern Mediterranean yielded texts on philosophy, mathematics, and medicine. Universities multiplied, creating communities where ideas could be compared, translated, and debated. By the 13th century, many classical works were available again, and teachers such as Robert Grosseteste and Roger Bacon began to explore nature through observation and measurement. They argued that mathematics offered a key to understanding creation, and that experience should guide reasoning. These early steps hinted at methods that would later blossom into modern science. Technology advanced with unexpected speed. Windmills turned across the fields of England, paper workshops appeared in Italian towns, and the spinning wheel changed the rhythm of household labour. Sailors learned to steer by the magnetic compass, while craftsmen shaped clearer lenses for spectacles. Numerical systems from the East simplified calculation, and new ship designs prepared the way for voyages beyond familiar seas. In little more than a century, Europe adopted more practical innovations than it had in many generations before. Art reflected the same restless energy. Earlier styles rooted in classical tradition gradually gave way to new forms that reached toward the sky. Gothic builders used pointed arches and flying buttresses to create spaces filled with light. Cathedrals such as Notre Dame seemed to rise weightlessly, their coloured windows transforming sunlight into shimmering stories of faith. Manuscripts glowed with miniature paintings, and artists from Britain to Byzantium developed distinct local voices. Literature flourished in many tongues. Latin chronicles stood beside songs of heroes and legends of Arthur and Charlemagne. German poets reshaped ancient myths into sweeping epics, while southern France nurtured the delicate art of the troubadours, whose verses celebrated love and courtesy. In Italy, this tradition helped inspire the new poetic language that would soon reach its height with Dante. In Constantinople, scholars continued to study Plato and Aristotle, producing histories and philosophical dialogues that preserved the memory of classical Greece. Music, too, changed its character. Monasteries had long guarded the solemn melodies of plainchant, but by the 12th century, composers in Paris were weaving several voices together into early polyphony. The invention of clearer musical notation allowed singers to remember complex pieces, and figures such as Hildegard of Bingen gave sacred song a personal and visionary tone. Beyond the church walls, wandering troubadours and minnesingers carried secular music from court to court. Theatre returned to public life as towns grew wealthier. Guilds staged religious plays that connected biblical stories with everyday trades, and entire cycles of dramas were performed in marketplaces from York to Cologne. Humour and satire found their way onto the stage beside devils and saints, while in France and Germany, lively farces delighted audiences with earthy jokes and bold characters. Across medieval Europe, there emerged a political creature unlike the tight, centralized kingdoms that later dominated the continent. It was vast but uneven, powerful yet fragmented, and it gathered many peoples under a single imperial idea. This was the Holy Roman Empire, a shifting constellation of lands in Western, Central, and parts of Southern Europe that took shape out of the early medieval world and survived in one form or another until it was formally ended in the age of Napoleon. Its foundation was not a clean moment of creation, but a slow joining of crowns, titles, and ambitions. Over time, rulers in the German lands linked their authority with northern Italy, drawing in additional regions through dynastic ties and political agreements. Burgundy and Bohemia became important pillars as well, and by the late 15th century, the empire was still imagined as a structure built around large zones, even if reality looked far messier. Italy remained part of the imperial map on paper, yet in practice it splintered into city-states, duchies, and local powers that often acted independently. Some Italian territories drifted steadily away from imperial influence, while others fell under the shadow of the Habsburg dynasty, when local ruling lines died out and succession disputes drew outside forces in. Despite these internal shifts, the empire's outer borders changed far less dramatically than its internal balance, and many lines on the map remained surprisingly stable until the final crisis of the early 19th century. After the empire's end, most of its former German lands were reorganized into a looser federation, while the Italian states largely followed a separate path. The imperial story is often traced back to a winter ceremony in the year 800, when a pope placed an emperor's crown on the head of the Frankish king, Charlemagne. The act carried enormous symbolism. It suggested that the authority of ancient Rome, lost in the West centuries earlier, could be revived in a new Christian form. In diplomacy, the emperor was treated as first among equals, not as a universal monarch who could command other kings, but as a ruler with special prestige. After Charlemagne, the title passed within his family for a time, then became a prize fought over in Italian conflicts as the Carolingian world broke apart. For decades, emperors crowned in Rome often controlled little beyond parts of Italy, and the old imperial unity faded into memory. The title gained lasting continuity only in the 10th century when Otto, a powerful German king, crossed into Italy and secured the crown with papal support. His coronation in 962 became a turning point because it connected three forces that would shape the empire's future: the German kingship, the Italian crown, and the authority of the papacy. From that time onward, the empire endured for centuries, though never as a single unified state. It was more a framework of legitimacy than a tightly governed nation, and its rulers constantly had to negotiate with princes, bishops, and cities that guarded their rights with fierce pride. Even the name by which the empire is remembered emerged gradually. Early medieval rulers did not commonly speak of a Holy Roman Empire as a formal title. Different phrases circulated over time, reflecting changing political needs. The idea of holiness was attached more openly in the 12th century, when emperors sought to assert moral and spiritual legitimacy while competing for influence in Italy. Later, as the empire's centre of gravity shifted increasingly toward the German lands, an additional label emphasising the German nation became more common, partly to acknowledge the political weight of the German princes and estates that increasingly shaped imperial policy. By the 18th century, that longer label was used less in official settings, even as outsiders mocked the contradiction between the empire's grand name and its complicated realities. In practical terms, the empire was never able to become a unified kingdom like France. Instead, it evolved into a layered system with hundreds of territories ranging from duchies and counties to church lands ruled by bishops, plus free cities that governed themselves and answered directly to the emperor. The emperor stood at the top, but his power depended on alliances and consent. Princes and city councils could cooperate with him, resist him, or simply pursue their own interests, while still claiming loyalty to the imperial structure. The office itself was traditionally elective. Powerful nobles known as prince-electors chose a candidate from among the leading dynasties. That candidate ruled first as King of the Romans, and only later, when conditions allowed, took on the full imperial dignity. In the early centuries, a papal coronation in Rome mattered greatly, but over time, that ritual lost its central role, and emperors increasingly claimed authority without waiting for the Pope's approval. The end came in a moment of high drama. In 1806, under the pressure of Napoleonic conquest and the creation of a French-backed alliance in Germany, Emperor Francis II renounced the imperial title and dissolved the empire, bringing to a close a political tradition that had lasted more than 800 years in its later form. To understand how such an empire could exist, it helps to look back to the collapse of Roman authority in the West. In the 5th century, as Roman control weakened in Gaul, Germanic groups filled the vacuum. The Franks became the most important of these powers. Under the Merovingian dynasty, they built a large kingdom, but by the 8th century, their kings had become ceremonial figures, while real authority passed to a new family, the Carolingians. Charles Martel and his heirs controlled armies and lands, and his son, Pepin, took the royal crown with papal approval, tying Frankish power to the church in a lasting partnership. Pepin's son, Charlemagne, expanded that realm with relentless energy, conquering and organising territories that stretched across much of Western and Central Europe, and pushing into northern Italy. This expansion mattered not only for its size, but for the way it linked military strength with religious protection. In Italy, tensions between the Pope and the Byzantine Emperor had been growing for years, and religious disputes deepened the rift. When a woman ruled as empress in Constantinople, Western leaders questioned the legitimacy of the Eastern throne and searched for a new protector. Charlemagne, already defending papal lands against local threats, became the obvious candidate. The coronation of 800 presented itself as a renewal of Roman authority, even as it created a new rivalry, because Byzantium still considered itself the true Roman Empire. After Charlemagne's death, his heirs struggled to hold the giant realm together. Civil wars, treaties, and partitions divided the empire into rival kingdoms. The imperial title survived, but it drifted from one contender to another as political unity dissolved. By the late 9th century, the old structure shattered completely, and regional rulers began choosing their own kings. Italy continued to produce claimants to the imperial dignity, but their reach was limited and the title lost its broader meaning. Meanwhile, in East Francia, the land that would become the medieval German kingdom, strong regional duchies reasserted themselves. After the last Carolingian ruler there died without an heir, the nobles elected one of their own as king. That choice marked a shift toward an elective tradition that never fully disappeared. Power later concentrated under the Saxon dynasty when Henry the Fowler secured the throne and stabilized the realm. His son Otto inherited not only the crown, but also the challenge of controlling ambitious dukes. Otto defeated internal rebellions, used church leaders as administrators, and built a kingship that could act across a wide territory without relying on a single capital. The royal court moved constantly, governing from different palaces and strongholds depending on season, politics, and need. Otto's rise became imperial when events in Italy pulled him south. A struggle over the Italian crown gave him the chance to intervene, marry into local legitimacy, and take control. Soon after, a decisive victory against the Magyars secured his prestige in the German lands, and his alliance with the papacy brought the imperial crown. This moment did not create a centralized empire, but it did create a lasting formula. A German king who claimed a Roman imperial identity, ruled with the Church's involvement, and treated Italy as part of the wider framework. The relationship between emperor and pope was never peaceful for long. Otto himself deposed a pope and installed another, revealing how quickly spiritual authority could become a battlefield of politics. Rivalry with Constantinople also flared, especially when later emperors used titles that implied universal Roman legitimacy. Marriage alliances linked the imperial court to Byzantium, yet tension remained. In Rome, noble families resented foreign control, revolts broke out, and emperors marched south to reassert authority. One young ruler installed the first German pope, only to face renewed hostility from Roman elites. The pattern became familiar. The empire's claims were grand, but enforcing them required constant negotiation, occasional violence, and careful management of powerful local forces. By the early 11th century, the empire's structure continued to evolve. A ruler such as Henry II concentrated on consolidating authority in the German lands, while his successor, Conrad II, was chosen after negotiation among nobles, who increasingly acted as kingmakers. Over time, this developed into a more formal group of electors, the elite who would shape imperial succession for centuries. In theory, the empire eventually contained several kingdoms under one imperial roof. Germany formed the core. Italy remained connected to the imperial idea for a long time, even as it fragmented politically. Bohemia rose from a duchy to a kingdom, gaining special standing within the imperial system. Burgundy was added through dynastic inheritance, though its place in the imperial structure weakened over later centuries. These labels suggested unity, but in practice the empire remained a complicated mosaic, held together less by direct rule than by tradition, legal claims, and the continuing belief that an emperor could still represent the highest dignity of Christian monarchy in the West. In the German lands of the 11th century, kings did not rule only through armies and nobles. They also ruled through the church. Bishops were not simply spiritual leaders. They were educated administrators, trusted advisors, and holders of land. Emperors and kings often treated major church appointments as political tools, deciding who would receive a bishop's staff or an abbot's seat, and expecting loyalty in return. Over time, however, a reform movement spreading through monasteries and church councils began to frame this royal control as a dangerous corruption. The papacy increasingly argued that spiritual offices should not be granted by secular hands, and that the church must be freed from worldly interference. That tension erupted into a dramatic showdown between Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV. Gregory was determined to force a change, not through polite warnings, but through confrontation. Henry, still young when he inherited his throne, refused to accept a pope who claimed the right to dictate how the empire should manage its bishops. The conflict quickly became personal and symbolic. Henry rejected the pope's authority and treated him not as a sacred figure, but as a political rival. Gregory responded with a weapon that shook the medieval world. He declared the king cut off from the church, stripped him of legitimacy, and released Henry's subjects from their oaths of loyalty. For a ruler whose power depended on alliances and sworn obligations, this was devastating. Support collapsed. Noblemen who had long wanted to limit royal authority saw an opening, and they moved to replace Henry with a rival candidate. Facing the risk of losing his crown, Henry made the journey across the Alps in winter and appeared before the Pope at Canossa, seeking forgiveness. The scene became legendary, not because it ended the conflict, but because it revealed something new. Even an emperor could be forced into humiliation when spiritual authority was turned into political force. The crisis did not stop there. The rival king chosen by the princes became a new source of civil war. Henry eventually defeated his opponent, yet rebellions continued to flare, and the Pope's punishment returned more than once. Even within Henry's household, power struggles erupted, with his own sons joining rebellions against him. When Henry finally died, the problem he had fought over was still unresolved. But the struggle had already changed the empire. It had exposed the limits of kingship, weakened the sacred aura that once protected royal authority, and elevated the papacy and the great princes into central actors of imperial politics. In the same era, the lands east of the old Frankish heartlands were undergoing a quieter but equally important transformation. Large stretches of Central Europe were less densely populated than the Rhine Valley or northern Italy, and ambitious nobles and rulers encouraged settlement in these regions. Farmers, artisans, and traders moved eastward into frontier zones, founding villages, clearing forests, and building new towns. Over generations, this migration reshaped the linguistic and cultural map. Regions that are now associated with Poland and the Czech lands gained strong German-speaking communities, particularly in areas where rulers sought new revenue and more direct control. Some territories entered the imperial orbit through political maneuvering and local ambition rather than conquest alone. In Silesia, dukes from the Piast family pursued greater independence from the Polish crown and drew closer to the empire, gradually shifting the region's direction. Farther north, Pomerania became tied to imperial influence as local rulers accepted overlordship. The Baltic frontier also saw dramatic changes when crusading forces and military religious orders expanded into pagan lands. In several areas, settlement and conquest combined to create new societies with mixed populations and competing identities. While the eastern frontier expanded, the empire's internal politics shifted again after the death of Henry V. His dynasty ended without a clear successor, and the princes used the opportunity to prove that the crown depended on their choice, not on blood alone. They selected Lothair of Saxony, a ruler with enough authority to govern but not enough to dominate them. When he died, they repeated the strategy by rejecting the heir he preferred and choosing a rival candidate. This decision opened a long struggle between two great aristocratic houses, a conflict that would shape imperial politics for more than a century. Out of this rivalry emerged the Hohenstaufen dynasty, whose most famous ruler, Frederick Barbarossa, tried to strengthen the empire through law, ritual, and controlled force. He sought compromise at home while projecting power abroad. One method was to rely less on the traditional dukes and more on a new class of servants and soldiers who owed their position to the ruler. These men, originally bound to service in exchange for land and status, helped form the foundations of a broader, knightly class. Another strategy was legal reform. Medieval politics had long been haunted by private feuds and personal revenge. Imperial decrees aimed to restrain violence by declaring peace across the realm and turning conflict into a matter for courts rather than swords. The idea was ambitious: to bind nobles, bishops, and towns to a common order of justice and punishment. At the same time, new cities appeared across the empire. Population growth and expanding trade created the demand, but political calculation also played a role. Founding a town on a strategic river crossing or along a trade route concentrated wealth where rulers could tax it and defend it. Many of these cities began as planned settlements, rather than ancient Roman foundations. Places like Freiburg and Munich represent that wave of urban creation, where economic opportunity and political control grew side by side. Frederick's attention repeatedly turned toward Italy, where wealthy northern cities guarded their freedoms and resisted imperial demands. He framed his authority in Roman terms, presenting the emperor's rights as ancient and lawful. Assemblies in Italy listed these imperial privileges in detail, linking them to the traditions of Roman governance. Roads, tolls, coinage, fines, and appointments were treated not as negotiable favours, but as rights that belonged to the emperor by tradition. Yet asserting those rights required armies, and in Italy, armies met organised resistance. Frederick also became entangled in disputes within the church, backing rival claimants against a reigning pope and prolonging a crisis that only ended when political reality forced reconciliation. Back in Germany, Frederick's relationship with his most powerful ally, Henry the Lion, gradually collapsed. Henry offered limited support when Frederick needed troops for Italy, and the emperor eventually chose to break him. Legal proceedings declared Henry an outlaw, and his vast holdings were confiscated and redistributed. The episode revealed again how imperial authority worked. Not through permanent bureaucracy, but through public judgment, noble cooperation, and the emperor's ability to turn rival powers against one another. Frederick later joined the Third Crusade and died on the journey, far from the German heartlands. After him, the Hohenstaufen reached their height under Henry VI, who added Sicily to the family's possessions and pursued the dream of turning the elective empire into a hereditary monarchy. But death arrived before the plan could be secured. His heir was still a child, and the princes once again acted to protect their influence by choosing an adult rival. The result was a divided kingship, with competing claimants supported by different factions. Assassination, shifting alliances, and papal strategy turned the struggle into a long contest for survival. Eventually, Frederick II returned to claim the crown, defeating his rival and becoming emperor. Yet his rule revealed a deeper problem. His attention centered on Sicily and Italy, where he built a stronger, more modern style of administration, while Germany was treated as a realm that could be managed through grants and privileges. To keep order north of the Alps, without constant imperial presence, Frederick handed sweeping rights to princes and bishops. These concessions strengthened local rulers. Control over fortifications, tolls, coinage, and other revenues increasingly became their domain. Over time, this accelerated the empire's fragmentation. Princes were no longer merely office holders serving the crown. They were spoken of as owners of their lands, a change in political language that signaled a change in reality. Meanwhile, Eastern expansion continued in complex ways. Settlers moved into Slavic regions, building farms and towns, trading in markets, and gradually changing the cultural landscape. Local rulers intermarried across language lines, and loyalties shifted according to advantage. Military religious orders were invited into frontier zones under the promise of conversion and defense. In Prussia, a crusading order created a powerful state of its own. Yet this new Baltic power did not simply become an obedient province of the empire. It followed its own path, fighting neighbours and expanding through war, and it later became part of a different political story. Bohemia rose as a key regional force during these centuries. Its rulers gained recognition as kings and secured privileges that reduced their obligations to the empire while increasing their prestige within it. Prague would later become one of the great political and cultural centres of Central Europe, tied to the imperial system yet proud of its own identity. After the death of Frederick II, stability collapsed again. Rival claimants emerged, and no ruler could command universal recognition. This period of uncertainty allowed princes to deepen their independence, strengthen their administrations, and treat their territories more openly as personal states. Foreign candidates became involved, crowns were promised and contested, and years passed without a strong crowned authority at the centre. Eventually, a relatively minor count from the Habsburg family was chosen as king, marking the rise of a dynasty that would later dominate Central European politics. But even then, the imperial title did not automatically bring unity, and the crown's weakness remained visible. During the 13th century, Europe's economy and society were also changing from within. Money increasingly replaced personal service as the basic language of obligation. Peasants were required to pay rents and tribute, and ownership of land became ever more closely linked to legal authority. Courts relied heavily on custom rather than written statutes, but power was becoming more territorial and more concentrated. The foundations of modern statehood began to appear unevenly across the empire, advancing faster in some regions than in others. Trade networks strengthened the cities. Merchant communities formed alliances for protection and profit, coordinating shipping routes, defending convoys and negotiating privileges. The Hanseatic League became the most famous of these networks, linking port cities and river towns across northern Europe. It did not erase the sovereignty of local rulers, but it gave merchants collective strength, and in time, it even used armed force to defend its interests. Its influence reached a peak in the later Middle Ages before slowly declining as political conditions changed and new economic powers rose. As the Middle Ages moved forward, the empire's greatest weakness became impossible to ignore. Choosing a ruler was never simple. Elections could drag on, rival candidates could split the princes, and long periods of uncertainty could leave the realm drifting without clear leadership. Out of these recurring crises, a more formal solution emerged. The right to elect the king was gradually concentrated into the hands of a fixed group of leading princes, and their role was eventually defined in a famous set of rules issued in the mid-14th century. From that point onward, the empire was no longer imagined as the personal possession of the emperor. It became something separate from him, a political body with its own traditions and rights, even when the emperor stood at its symbolic summit. The new election rules changed the tone of imperial politics. The crown was no longer expected to be granted only through complete agreement among all electors. A majority was enough. The electors themselves gained powerful privileges that made them more than mere voters. Their title became hereditary, their courts gained stronger authority, and their financial independence grew. They could mint coins, enforce justice, and act as rulers with a status that was almost sovereign inside their territories. Even culture was drawn into this system, as the education of their heirs was expected to include the major languages used in imperial affairs. This shift in power can also be seen in the way kings tried to support themselves. In earlier centuries, the ruler had relied heavily on imperial lands and revenues that were not tied to any dynasty, lands that belonged to the crown itself and included important cities. Over time, these possessions became less useful. They were scattered, hard to administer, and expensive to defend. As the political landscape grew more territorial, rulers increasingly pawned pieces of the crown lands to local lords. Sometimes this was done to raise money, sometimes to secure loyalty, and sometimes to manage powerful dukes by giving them incentives rather than confronting them. The long-term effect was predictable. The independent resources of the crown shrank, and the ruler's authority became more dependent on personal family strength. From the late 13th century onward, a new pattern became normal. The king's real base of power was no longer the empire's shared property, but the compact lands of his own house. These territories were easier to govern because they formed a coherent block, rather than a scattered patchwork. Dynasties began to treat their family lands as the engine that could carry them to the imperial throne and keep them there. Austria and Styria became the foundation of one such house. Bavaria anchored another. Bohemia became the power centre of a third. In every case, the same logic returned. Strengthening the authority of territorial princes was not always a loss for the ruler, because the ruler was often a territorial prince himself. What benefited the princes in general could also benefit the king in his own lands. By the early 15th century, the empire still lacked a stable structure that could function without a strong monarch constantly present. Some rules existed, but day-to-day cooperation between the king, the electors, and other princes depended heavily on personality and circumstance. When emperors spent most of their time in their hereditary lands, rather than travelling through the old imperial heartlands, the traditional gatherings that once helped hold the system together weakened. Without regular royal presence, feuds between princes became more common, and disputes that might have been contained turned into small wars. At the same time, the church faced its own storms. Rival claimants fought for leadership, and the resulting turmoil shook confidence in the old idea that Christendom should be guided by two great pillars, the church and the empire, working together to lead a unified Christian world. As that vision faded, politics became more local and more pragmatic. In the German lands, the question became urgent. How could peace be maintained in a realm where no ruler could simply impose it? Older narratives often describe this period as chaos, but a closer look reveals another side. Peace was not only a command issued by kings, it was also something built from below through alliances. Regional coalitions of princes, nobles, and cities formed leagues that pledged to keep order. They set up mechanisms for arbitration, created temporary courts, and agreed on joint action against violent outlaws or rulers who tried to settle disputes by force. These arrangements did not create a modern state, but they showed that the empire could still generate order through cooperation, even when the crown was weak. Still, many leaders wanted something more permanent. Some influential figures argued that peace and justice needed stronger institutions that would not vanish when a king was absent. In this climate, the language of reform gained momentum, meaning a return to a stronger shape that had supposedly existed in earlier centuries. The pressure reached a breaking point when a ruler needed money and political backing for war, and, at the same time, sought to secure the election of his heir. The princes used the opportunity to demand a greater voice in imperial justice and administration. Out of these negotiations came a decisive moment at the end of the 15th century. An imperial assembly, now more clearly defined and gradually becoming a regular institution, agreed on a package of measures meant to give the fractured realm a framework that could survive beyond any single reign. New regional groupings were created to organise defence and administration. A central court was established to handle disputes that could not be settled locally, offering a legal alternative to private warfare. These innovations were not instantly effective. It took decades for the system to become widely accepted and for the new court to function with real authority. Even then, the ruler maintained a separate royal council that worked alongside the central court, ensuring that the emperor still had his own judicial instrument. During this period, the empire also adopted a longer official name that emphasized its German character, reflecting a reality that had been developing for generations. Italy and Burgundy remained important in history and tradition, but in practice, the empire's political centre was now firmly anchored in the German lands. Then, the 16th century brought a new kind of shock. Dynastic inheritance produced a ruler whose title stretched across Europe. The Spanish kingdoms were united under a single monarch, and soon that same monarch took the imperial crown. For a moment, it looked like a vast personal empire might dominate the continent. Yet the weight of these different inheritances pulled in different directions. The Spanish realms followed their own priorities. The German princes guarded their autonomy, and the imperial crown became only one piece in a far larger set of responsibilities. The union between Spanish and imperial power did not last as a single, unified project. It split between branches of the ruling house, dividing Spanish rule from the Austrian line that increasingly shaped the empire's future. Even more disruptive than dynastic politics was the religious rupture sparked by Martin Luther. His challenge to church authority quickly became a political weapon in the hands of princes who wanted to resist imperial dominance. The empire fractured along confessional lines. Many northern and eastern territories and a number of major cities embraced Protestant reforms, while large parts of the south and west remained loyal to Catholic tradition. Attempts to restore unity through force led to exhaustion and compromise, and religious peace was established only in limited form, recognizing some confessions while excluding others. For a time, the empire lived in a tense balance. External threats pressed in from several directions. The Ottoman power loomed in the east, and major war there often required the emperor to negotiate with Protestant princes for support. In the west, France steadily expanded its influence along the Rhine. In the Low Countries, revolt against Spanish authority reshaped the political map, and the empire's neutrality effectively allowed a major region to slip away. As the 17th century approached, imperial authority weakened further. A ruler based in Bohemia withdrew from active governance, and confessional conflict sharpened. When Bohemia rose in rebellion, the spark ignited a wider catastrophe. The 30 Years' War devastated the empire, drawing in foreign powers that fought on German soil and seized advantages for themselves. The peace settlement that ended the conflict confirmed what the war had already proven. The territories now possessed near-complete independence in practice, and the emperor's role became more symbolic than commanding. From then on, the empire endured less as a unified state than as a framework. Some regions formally stepped outside its structure, including the Swiss lands and the northern Netherlands. The Habsburg emperors focused increasingly on strengthening their hereditary domains, since that was where real power could still be exercised directly. The empire continued to exist, but it operated like a legal and ceremonial umbrella over a mosaic of states. The 18th century intensified the rivalry inside this mosaic. Austria and Prussia emerged as competing poles, and their struggle shaped German politics for generations. Meanwhile, the French Revolution opened a new era of war and reorganization. Territories were merged, church lands were secularized, and hundreds of small rulers lost their independence as larger states absorbed them. This process did not happen in a single stroke. It unfolded through pressure, war, and political bargaining, steadily removing the older patchwork that had defined the empire for centuries. The final act came in the early 19th century, after defeat by Napoleon and the creation of a French-backed confederation in Germany. The last emperor renounced the ancient title and declared the empire ended. The Habsburg dynasty continued as rulers of Austria and Hungary, but the old imperial framework was gone. After Napoleon's fall, the German lands were reorganized again into a new federation, and later into a Prussian-led union that paved the way toward modern Germany. Yet the legacy of the old empire remained visible. A few historic members retained their monarchical identity into the modern age, such as Luxembourg and Liechtenstein. Two former free cities also survived as political entities within Germany. Most of the countless other states vanished or transformed into modern forms of government. At its core, the Holy Roman Empire had never been a centralized nation. It was a vast collection of territories ruled by princes, bishops, and city councils, each guarding its privileges. The emperor could not simply issue commands as a modern head of state might. Authority depended on negotiation, law, alliances, and the constant balancing of interests. Over the centuries, emperors granted autonomy to survive, and each concession strengthened local rulers further. The process began early, accelerated through religious conflict, and was effectively sealed after the great peace settlements of the 17th century. In the imperial assemblies, the number of represented territories was enormous, and the empire often looked like a patchwork quilt of jurisdictions. Some lands were ruled by hereditary nobles, others were governed by church leaders who held both spiritual authority and secular power. Free cities answered directly to the emperor in theory, while scattered knights and counts held special status without always having a voice in the central gatherings. By the late 18th century, the number of such imperial entities had reached into the thousands, a reminder of how deeply the empire had preserved medieval diversity, even as the rest of Europe moved towards centralization. By the 17th century, the empire looked less like a single realm and more like a landscape of unequal powers. A handful of dynasties ruled territories large enough to feel like states, while hundreds of smaller lords held slices of land that could be crossed in a day. Among all of them, the Austrian Habsburgs stood far above the rest. Their possessions inside the imperial framework stretched across a vast block of Central Europe, anchored in the Danube region and reaching deep into the Bohemian lands. By comparison, the other leading German rulers controlled domains that were substantial but far smaller. Saxony, Bavaria, and Brandenburg each held territories of roughly similar scale, and the Duke of Brunswick-Lüneburg governed a realm in the same general range. The Palatinate was important in politics, but weaker in land and resources, while the great church electorates, Mainz, Cologne, and Trier, were influential largely because of their position in the imperial system, rather than because of their size. Beyond these stood medium powers like Württemberg, Hessen-Kassel, and Mecklenburg-Schwerin, along with major church territories such as Salzburg and Münster. Most of the remaining states were tiny, and at the extreme end were the lands of the imperial knights. Hundreds of families whose combined territory amounted to little more than scattered pockets. The pattern was different beyond Germany. In the Italian parts associated with the empire, the political map was more coherent. Large blocks of territory were held by recognizable powers: Savoy in the northwest, Tuscany in the centre, Genoa on the Ligurian coast, several duchies in Emilia, and Spanish rule in Milan and much of Lombardy. These states were populous by early modern standards, often counting hundreds of thousands, sometimes more than 1 million people, and their institutions could appear more concentrated than the patchwork north of the Alps. The Low Countries also formed a more unified zone, tied to Spanish rule and treated as part of the imperial world at least in name, even when the reality was drifting towards separation. At the heart of the system stood a title that mattered as much as any army: King of the Romans. A man did not begin as emperor, he began as the king chosen to become one. This custom reached back to the early medieval era when leading groups in the German land selected a ruler from among the strongest candidates. Over time, the right to choose the king narrowed into the hands of the most powerful princes and church leaders, until an official list of electors became fixed in the 14th century. The final group included the King of Bohemia, 3 major secular princes, and 3 archbishops, whose influence blended faith and politics. Later centuries added new electors as wars and dynastic bargains reshaped the balance. Bavaria gained a vote during the Great Confessional Conflicts, and Hanover later joined the circle as another major power. By the last decades of the empire, more rearrangements were planned. But the end came before those new electors truly mattered. Election was never a pure ceremony. Votes were won through negotiation. A candidate usually had to promise land, money, privileges, or political support in return for backing. Once elected, the new king could claim imperial dignity only after a coronation that had long been associated with papal approval. In practice, the journey to Italy and the ritual itself could be delayed for years by rebellion, war, or disputes with the Pope. Eventually, the crown stopped depending on Rome at all. Emperors began to treat the election as sufficient and styled themselves as chosen emperors, without waiting for a papal ceremony. By the 16th century, the old coronation tradition survived more as a memory than as a requirement. The office was shaped by assumptions that were rarely written into a single law, but were powerful nonetheless. The emperor was expected to be male, noble, and acceptable to the electors whose world was still heavily Catholic. That reality made a Protestant emperor essentially impossible even after religious division fractured the empire. Questions of identity also mattered. In earlier centuries, the throne could be held by rulers, whose origins were not strongly tied to the German lands, but as the early modern period advanced, German background came to be treated as almost essential. Political legitimacy, not just blood, shaped what seemed acceptable. Once an emperor existed, power still had to be managed through institutions. The imperial diet was the main arena where the empire's politics played out. It was not a parliament in the modern sense, and it was not designed to impose swift decisions on a nation. It was a forum for bargaining, compromise, and slow consensus. In principle, it could stand above the emperor in matters of law and rights because the empire was understood as a shared order, rather than the private domain of a monarch. The Diet was organised into 3 groups. The electors formed the first and most prestigious council, because they chose the king. The second council brought together the other princes, divided between secular rulers and church rulers. The highest princes spoke with their own votes, while lesser lords were clustered into regional groupings that shared a collective vote. The third council represented the imperial cities, split into 2 regional colleges. These cities were wealthy and often independent in daily affairs, yet their influence was limited by tradition. They could speak and negotiate, but on certain issues they were not treated as fully equal partners. Even their formal recognition as a permanent estate came late, after the great 17th century peace that ended the most destructive war the empire had ever known. Justice also reflected the empire's dual nature. 2 high courts sat at the summit of the legal system. One was closely tied to the emperor's household and acted as a royal council for legal disputes. The other, created as part of late medieval reforms, aimed to offer a more regular and empire-wide tribunal. Their responsibilities overlapped in some areas and remained separate in others. Disputes over public peace, property conflicts between different territories, violations of imperial rules, and conflicts involving imperial finances could be brought before the central court. Other matters, especially those linked to imperial fiefs or high political questions, often fell under the emperor's own council. The result was not a clean hierarchy, but a layered system in which law served as both a tool of order and a battleground between competing authorities. To make such a fragmented realm governable, the empire also developed regional groupings known as circles. These were administrative zones designed to organize defense, coordinate taxation, oversee coinage, and enforce peace. Each circle held its own assemblies and had directors who tried to coordinate policy. Yet even here, the empire could not reach everywhere. Some lands remained outside the circle structure, including the Bohemian crown lands, Switzerland, the Italian fiefs linked to the empire, the territories of imperial knights, and several other smaller exceptions. The circles improved coordination, but they never turned the empire into a centralized state. Military power worked the same way. The empire had an army on paper, but not a permanent standing force ready to march at a moment's notice. When danger rose, troops were gathered from the various member states to form an imperial campaign force. In reality, those soldiers often felt stronger loyalty to their local rulers than to an emperor they might never see. The imperial army was therefore always a political project as much as a military one, depending on negotiation, quotas, and willingness rather than strict command. Even the empire's geography shaped how it functioned. For much of its history, rulers governed on the move. Kings and emperors travelled between palaces and favoured residences, staying long enough to hold court, issue judgments, negotiate with local elites, and collect revenues. Certain rulers preferred certain centres. Aachen in the early period, Palermo under a ruler who governed from the Mediterranean world, Munich under Bavarian dynasts, Prague under emperors who leaned toward Bohemia, and Vienna as Habsburg power became dominant. Over time, the travelling court gradually gave way to more permanent capitals, but the empire itself never had one single seat that could control everything. The Diet also moved from city to city for centuries, meeting wherever politics and logistics allowed, until it eventually settled permanently in Regensburg. Coronations and elections likewise shifted in location. Earlier emperors travelled to Italy for papal coronation, but later elections became concentrated in Frankfurt, reflecting how the empire's political centre had moved north of the Alps. Foreign policy revealed another limitation. The empire did not develop a unified foreign ministry in the modern sense. The Habsburgs maintained their own diplomats to defend dynastic interests, and after the mid-17th century, other major principalities did the same. Diplomats gathered where imperial politics could be watched most closely, especially in Regensburg. There, foreign envoys could meet representatives of the German estates directly, because that was where negotiations happened. Some foreign powers even held land inside the empire, which gave them a formal stake in its assemblies. Trying to measure population in such a fragmented system was always uncertain. There were no central offices capable of counting subjects across hundreds of states. Estimates varied widely, and catastrophic events could reset numbers for generations. The 30 Years' War, in particular, produced a demographic shock so severe that later recovery was slow and uneven. By many estimates, the empire in the early 18th century was still struggling to surpass the population levels it had reached before the war began. In the early 17th century, the Habsburg lands inside the empire contained several million subjects, far more than any other single electorate. Saxony counted around 1 million, Bavaria somewhat less, and the Palatinate and Brandenburg held smaller but still significant populations. The church electorates together held hundreds of thousands. Beyond Germany, the Spanish Habsburgs also ruled millions inside the broader imperial framework through their possessions in the Burgundian Circle and Milan. Later, estimates for the empire as a whole often suggest a population in the tens of millions by the 18th century, though the precise number depends heavily on whether Italy and other peripheral zones are included, and on which borders are used for calculation. By 1800, after the empire had already lost major regions through war and political separation, a broad estimate still placed its population in the high 20s of millions, with the largest shares concentrated in Austrian and Prussian territories and the remainder spread across the many smaller states. For much of the empire's history, religious unity was treated as part of political order. Until the mid-16th century, Roman Catholic Christianity stood as the only officially accepted faith across the imperial framework, and the emperor himself was always expected to belong to it. That did not mean everyone believed the same way in everyday life, but it did mean the state recognized only one confession as legitimate. When reform movements spread across the German lands, the empire faced a practical problem it could not solve by force alone. Too many rulers, cities, and communities had already changed their religious loyalties, and the old assumption of a single church no longer matched reality. The first major compromise came in the 16th century, when Lutheran Christianity gained legal recognition and could exist openly under imperial law. Nearly a century later, another settlement broadened this recognition to include the Reformed tradition commonly associated with Calvinism. These two became the only Protestant branches that the imperial system treated as lawful. Other Protestant groups continued to exist, sometimes quietly, sometimes in open defiance, but without legal protection. Some were organized into distinct communities with their own disciplines and customs, including movements that later became known through groups such as Mennonites, Hutterites, Amish communities, and others. Their survival often depended on local conditions, distance from hostile authorities, protection by sympathetic lords, or the ability to move when pressure grew. Once Lutheranism gained official status, the empire tried to restore stability with a simple rule: the religion of a territory would follow the religion of its ruler. In practice, this turned dynastic politics into religious politics. A prince's personal choice could reshape the public worship of an entire land, and subjects who did not accept the new official faith faced a hard choice between conformity, exile, or quiet resistance. For a time, this principle created a kind of order, but it also locked religion into the machinery of power and made conversions politically explosive. After the Great Wars of the 17th century, the empire adjusted again. Instead of allowing the ruler's conversion to automatically pull everyone with him, the legal settlements fixed religious status to a normal year. Territories were expected to keep the public religious arrangements they had in that reference moment, and later, changes by a prince could not simply force a mass change of confession. This was a decisive shift in mentality. It accepted that permanent division was not a temporary crisis, but a lasting feature of imperial life. Alongside this, the settlements tried to protect minorities within each territory. A Catholic ruler could govern Protestant subjects, and a Protestant ruler could govern Catholic subjects, without stripping them of basic rights they already possessed at the reference point. Public worship belonged to the official faith, but private worship was usually tolerated for others, though it was meant to remain discreet and without the public signals that defined churches in the landscape. In theory, religion was not supposed to block access to commerce, craft, trade, or burial. In practice, local pressures and old hatreds often cut against this ideal. But the attempt itself marked a new approach. The empire was now treating religious pluralism as something to regulate rather than something to eradicate. Within this same world, Jewish communities continued to exist as a minority across many imperial territories, living under a wide range of local restrictions and protections that varied sharply from place to place. While confessional division reshaped belief and politics, another framework shaped daily life for centuries: the land-based order commonly described as feudalism. the word itself can mislead, because medieval people did not sit down and invent a single system by that name. What existed was a cluster of practices and expectations that linked landholding to power, service, and social rank. The basic pattern was simple enough to observe. Land was the main form of wealth, and land was also the main tool of government. Those who controlled it could demand service from those beneath them, and they could offer protection in return. In its narrowest sense, this order revolved around relationships among warriors and nobles. A powerful lord granted a piece of land or the income from it to a follower. The follower, in return, owed service, often military service, but sometimes administrative work, counsel, or other duties. These relationships were not merely personal friendships, they were reinforced through ceremonies, promises, and expectations about loyalty. Over time, they could become hereditary in practice, with families treating their land and obligations as something passed down like an inheritance. In a broader sense, the land-based order shaped all layers of society. Nobles dominated the countryside through rights over courts, rents, and labour. Church institutions held lands too, and many bishops and monasteries acted as territorial lords. Peasants, who formed the majority, often lived within local arrangements that tied them to an estate through dues, labour services, and customary obligations. Villages might owe a share of crops, days of work, or payments to their lord. In return, they received access to land, protection, and the security of belonging to a recognised community. These arrangements differed from region to region and changed over time, but the general direction was clear. Land defined status, and status defined rights. Modern historians have long argued about whether feudalism is the best word for this world. Some prefer to use it because it offers a convenient label for land-based hierarchies and obligations. Others warn that the label blurs differences and suggests a single coherent model that never truly existed. The debate exists because medieval Europe did not operate by one blueprint. England, France, Germany, Italy, and Central Europe each developed distinct mixes of lordship, law, and military organisation. Even within one kingdom, neighbouring regions could look different depending on local customs, settlement patterns, or the strength of royal authority. The word's history also shows why it can be slippery. The vocabulary that later generated feudalism grew out of medieval legal language about land grants and obligations. Over the early modern centuries, writers began to use feudal as an adjective to describe older forms of government and property. In the 18th century, economic thinkers popularized phrases like feudal system as a way to contrast past economies with commercial and capitalist ones. From there, feudalism became a standard label in political debate, sometimes used neutrally, sometimes used as an insult for anything that looked backward, oppressive, or aristocratic. Because of that, the term was later exported far beyond medieval Europe. People began using it by analogy when describing societies that had powerful warriors, land-holding elites, and personal bonds of loyalty. Medieval Japan was often placed in this category, and sometimes other regions as well. Yet, analogies can be risky. Similar-looking hierarchies do not always function the same way, and the details, law, economy, land tenure, and political authority can differ dramatically. Even in Central and Eastern Europe, scholars have questioned how well the classic Western European model fits, since political and economic structures there sometimes followed different paths. Whatever label is used, the historical forces that produced this land-centered order are not hard to trace. When large empires weakened, especially when they lacked the bureaucracy and revenue systems needed to support professional armies, rulers sought other ways to reward service and secure loyalty. Granting land or rights over land became a practical solution. In many regions, mounted warfare raised the value of heavily equipped fighters, and supporting such warriors required resources that could not always be paid in cash. Land, therefore, became both salary and power base. As local lords gained control over justice, taxation, and defence, central authority often thinned out, and the countryside became governed through layered loyalties, rather than direct administration. This decentralising pattern was not permanent. In parts of Europe, monarchies later rebuilt stronger institutions, tax systems, courts, bureaucracies, and standing armies that reduced the need to govern through personal land-for-service bargains. As kings gained the ability to enforce laws and raise money more directly, the old relationships weakened or transformed. Some obligations turned into rents paid in cash. Some local rights were absorbed into royal courts. Some noble privileges survived but changed their meaning in a more centralised state. In the medieval world, land did not simply change hands as a private real estate deal. A grant of land usually followed a public act that turned a follower into a recognised dependent. Before a lord could assign a profitable estate, the relationship had to be created first, and it was created through ceremony. The scene often unfolded with deliberate symbolism. A man approached a higher-ranking figure, placed himself under that person's protection, and promised loyalty in exchange for support. The gesture mattered because it made the bond visible to witnesses. It was not only a personal promise, but a social fact everyone present was expected to remember. Two moments formed the heart of the ritual. First came the act of submission and acceptance, where the follower acknowledged the Lord's authority and the Lord accepted the follower into his circle. Then came the sworn promise of loyalty. This oath was more than polite language. It was a binding declaration that the new dependent would not betray his lord, would aid him when called, and would treat his interests as a priority. The lord, for his part, was expected to protect the follower from outside threats, and to defend the follower's standing against rivals. In an age where violence and intimidation were constant realities, protection was not an abstract ideal. It was often the reason a lesser man sought the relationship in the first place. Once the bond existed, land could be used to sustain it. The estate was not merely a reward. It was the economic engine that made service possible. A follower called to fight could not appear empty-handed, and equipment was expensive. Income drawn from land, rents, or rights attached to a manor helped fund horses, weapons, and the lifestyle required of a mounted warrior. Military support was therefore one of the central expectations in these arrangements. When a lord demanded aid, it often meant an obligation to appear for a campaign, to join an armed escort, or to contribute to the defence of a fortification and its surrounding district. Yet service was not limited to the battlefield. A follower might be expected to show up at the Lord's court, not only to pay respect, but to take part in routine governance. In a manner, that court could handle local disputes, decide punishments, enforce customary rules, and settle arguments over land or obligations. At higher levels, attendance had a political purpose. Lords used councils to gather the opinions of their dependents, measure support for a risky decision, and bind the group to a chosen course of action. When a major war was being considered, or when a powerful rival needed to be confronted, consultation with the leading followers could be as important as raising troops. These customs never operated identically across Europe. Local law, geography, and political strength shaped how obligations were enforced and how far a lord's authority truly reached. In some regions, the bond between lord and follower could create order by tying many small powers into a larger hierarchy. In other regions, the same practices produced confusion, especially when a follower promised loyalty to more than one lord. Conflicting obligations were not rare. A man might hold land from two different superiors, owe military service to each, and then be forced to choose when those superiors quarrelled. Over time, one solution was to identify a primary lord whose claim took precedence. That idea did not erase conflict, but it offered a rule to rank loyalties when loyalties collided. France provides a vivid example of how differently the same broad patterns could develop. During the central medieval centuries, royal power and older public institutions did not always maintain firm control in every region. In many places, authority slipped downward and outward, as local strongmen gathered power around castles and private forces. Rights that once looked like public functions began to appear as private possessions. Control over courts and punishments became a source of income. Fees connected to markets, roads, mills, forests, and other everyday necessities could be treated as a lord's property. As these rights multiplied, power often became intensely local. People living in one valley might answer to one set of demands, while the next valley faced another. Instead of a single chain of command, the landscape could become a patchwork of overlapping claims. Even so, this fragmentation did not unfold evenly. Some large lordships retained coherence and pushed back against the centrifugal pull. In certain regions, stronger rulers managed to keep their dependents tied closely to them, turning loyalty into a tool of control rather than a path to disintegration. Elsewhere, the pull toward local autonomy was stronger, and the number of competing authorities grew. The result was a Europe that looked orderly in some areas and deeply tangled in others, even within the same kingdom. By the early modern period, many of the military foundations of these relationships began to weaken. Warfare shifted away from relying primarily on land-holding nobles, bringing personal followings into the field. States increasingly leaned on trained professionals, paid forces and structures that depended more on taxation and administration than on private obligation. Demographic shocks and economic change also altered the balance between landlords and rural populations. Over time, obligations that had once been expressed as labour or personal service were frequently converted into cash payments, negotiated away, or resisted outright. Yet disappearance in practice did not mean disappearance in law. In several parts of Europe, dues and rights linked to older lordship survived as stubborn remnants. They could endure as rents, fees, and privileges embedded in local custom. When revolutionary movements swept through France, one of their most dramatic acts was to announce the end of these inherited burdens and privileges. The goal was not simply to rearrange government, but to strip away the legal traces of an older social order. Even then, the process was not always immediate. In some places, officials initially tried to convert old obligations into payments to compensate landowners, and resistance followed. The pressure of events later pushed change further, ending the payments and leaving rural people with land freed from many of the traditional demands. Elsewhere in Europe, forms of rural dependency lasted into the 19th century, and emancipation from bonded labour and servile status came later in different states, sometimes through reform, sometimes through crisis. Alongside the history of medieval relationships, another story unfolded much later, the history of the word used to describe them. People in the Middle Ages did not generally describe their society as a single named system in the way modern textbooks often do. The label that later became common was built afterward by scholars, lawyers, and political writers trying to make sense of the past. Enlightenment writers used the idea as a weapon against inherited privilege, portraying older rural rights and aristocratic advantages as symbols of backwardness. Economists later used the term to describe a world where wealth and rank were rooted in land rather than markets. Social theorists then adopted it to describe an era of class power built on control of farming land and the extraction of labour and dues from the rural majority. Modern historians have not always agreed on how useful that label really is. Some have preferred a narrow definition, focusing on the bond between lord and follower and the exchange of service for land. Others have argued that the wider social world must be included, because lordship shaped not only warriors, but also clergy, peasants, and even cultural life. Still others have warned that the label can create an illusion of uniformity, as if medieval Europe ran on one blueprint. The further the concept is stretched, the more it risks turning into a loose metaphor rather than a precise tool. That tension helps explain why many modern writers use the vocabulary carefully or avoid it altogether, choosing instead to describe specific practices, local arrangements, and documented obligations rather than forcing them into a single model. Used with care, the old ceremonies and obligations still reveal something essential about medieval power. Authority often worked through personal bonds made public, backed by land and enforced by local force. Protection was traded for loyalty. Service was funded through access to resources. Courts and councils stitched together small communities and wider politics. Over centuries, changing warfare, economic transformation, and growing state institutions reshaped these arrangements, leaving behind a long echo of rights and burdens that lasted well after the original relationships had faded. The Catholic Church, commonly called the Roman Catholic Church, is the largest Christian community in the world and one of the most enduring institutions in human history. Its reach is global, its leadership structure is highly organized, and its influence has extended far beyond worship into education, politics, art, and social life. At the center of this system stands the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, who is regarded within the Church as the chief pastor for the entire Catholic world. The Pope presides over a governing administration based in Vatican City, a small territory within Rome that functions as the Church's headquarters and the Pope's seat of government. Catholic identity is anchored in a shared statement of belief that emerged from the early centuries of Christianity. The Church presents itself as the continuation of the community, founded by Jesus and led by the apostles, with bishops understood as heirs to that apostolic leadership. Within this view, the Pope holds a special place because he is seen as the successor of Peter, the leading figure among the apostles in Catholic tradition. This claim is not only theological but also institutional, because it provides a framework for how authority and unity are meant to operate across many cultures and languages. Over time, the Catholic world developed into a family of distinct regional traditions that remain connected to Rome. Some follow the Latin tradition that became dominant in Western Europe, while others preserve older Eastern liturgical and spiritual customs. Together, they form a single communion with different styles of worship and spirituality, but a shared structure of leadership and a shared core of doctrine. Catholic practice is shaped by sacraments, ritual actions believed to communicate divine grace. Among these, the Eucharist stands at the centre. In the Mass, bread and wine are consecrated by a priest and treated not as symbols alone, but as a real participation in Christ's presence. This act of worship becomes the focal point of Catholic religious life, shaping everything from daily devotion to major festivals. Alongside this, Catholic tradition gives a prominent place to Mary, honoured with titles that reflect her role in the story of Jesus. Devotion to saints also became a major feature of Catholic culture, expressing the idea that holiness is not only a distant ideal but a lived reality embodied in human lives across time. the Church is also known for its social footprint. Across many centuries, it built schools, hospitals, shelters, and charitable networks, and it still operates large systems of education and care in many countries. Catholic social teaching places strong emphasis on supporting the poor, the sick, and the vulnerable, and frames charity as a practical duty rather than a private option. At the same time, Catholic moral teaching has drawn criticism in the modern era, especially on questions of sexuality, gender roles, and how church leadership responded to abuse within the clergy. These controversies have shaped public debate and forced the institution to confront painful failures as well as deep internal disagreement. To understand how the Catholic Church became what it is, the story begins inside the Roman Empire. Christianity formed around the life and teaching of Jesus in the 1st century in Judea. In its earliest phase, the movement spread through cities connected by Roman roads and sea routes, carried by missionaries, merchants, and small networks of believers. The empire's infrastructure made travel easier than in many earlier eras, and shared languages and urban culture allowed ideas to move across long distances. Yet, the new faith also created friction. Early Christians refused to worship the traditional gods of the empire, and that refusal was often read as disloyalty. Suspicion and periodic persecution followed, and these experiences shaped Christian identity for generations. A major turning point came when imperial policy shifted. Christianity was legalized in the early 4th century, and later it received official support at the level of state religion. As the Roman world changed, the Church had to adapt to new realities. In the West, imperial authority weakened and eventually fragmented under the pressure of political crisis and invasion. New Germanic kingdoms rose on Roman territory, many of them initially following a form of Christianity that differed from Roman orthodoxy. Over time, several of these rulers aligned themselves with the bishops of Rome and adopted the Catholic form of the faith, creating alliances that helped stabilize their rule and strengthen the position of the papacy. Monasteries also became crucial. They preserved learning, copied texts, trained clergy, and created networks of literacy that helped carry classical culture into the medieval era. Meanwhile, the Mediterranean balance of power changed dramatically with the rise of Islamic rule in the 7th and 8th centuries. Control of key regions shifted, and older political links between Rome and the Eastern Empire grew weaker. Cultural exchange continued, but the sense of a single unified Christian world was increasingly strained. Disputes about authority, theology, and custom multiplied across centuries. Gradually, the churches of the Greek-speaking East and the Latin-speaking West drifted apart, and the split became permanent in the 11th century. Earlier breaks had already occurred within Christianity over debates about the nature of Christ, leaving different Eastern Christian traditions outside Roman unity. Even so, parts of the East would later establish or restore communion with Rome, forming what are now called Eastern Catholic churches, which kept their distinctive rites while recognizing papal authority. During the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church grew into a central force in Western Europe. It shaped laws, crowned rulers, mediated disputes, and offered a shared moral language across kingdoms that often fought each other. Its monasteries and cathedral schools helped preserve learning and eventually contributed to the rise of universities. At the same time, the papacy became more structured and more independent. Reforms aimed at protecting clergy from secular control triggered fierce conflicts with emperors and kings, especially over who had the right to appoint bishops. These struggles were not merely theological debates. They were contests over power, wealth, and legitimacy, and they revealed how difficult it was to draw a clean line between spiritual authority and political rule in a society where church offices carried land, income, and influence. The Crusades added another layer to this story. Appeals for help from the Eastern Empire, combined with the ambitions of Western rulers and religious fervour among knights and commoners, produced major military campaigns toward the Eastern Mediterranean. These events strengthened some papal claims to leadership while also worsening relations with Eastern Christians, especially after episodes of violence that left deep scars. Back in Europe, religious life diversified. New movements formed that emphasized poverty, preaching, and direct engagement with ordinary people, creating influential religious orders that operated in towns and cities and became deeply involved in teaching and scholarship. By the time Europe entered the Renaissance, the Church stood as a major patron of culture. Some of the era's most famous buildings, paintings, and sculptures were created under its sponsorship. This artistic flowering, however, did not prevent criticism from growing. Debates over authority, corruption, and doctrine intensified in the early modern period, and the Protestant Reformation fractured Western Christianity further. As new denominations formed outside Roman authority, Europe's religious map became permanently divided, and political conflicts increasingly followed religious lines. In the modern era, the Catholic Church faced pressure from multiple directions. Revolutionary politics, nationalism, and ideologies that viewed clerical power as an obstacle to modern citizenship. In the 19th century, doctrines emphasizing papal authority were defined more sharply, even as the Pope's territorial rule in Italy collapsed. The 20th century brought further extremes. In some places, the Church endured aggressive persecution, while in others, it became a major voice in public life. During the Second World War, it condemned racist ideologies and aided victims, yet debates continue about whether its leadership did enough, soon enough, in the face of mass violence. After the war, many Catholic communities found themselves behind the Iron Curtain, where religious practice was often restricted and church institutions were placed under heavy surveillance. One of the most significant shifts of the modern period came through major reforms to Catholic worship and public engagement in the mid-20th century. Supporters saw these changes as a necessary opening to the contemporary world, while critics feared the loss of tradition and clarity. Since then, Catholicism has continued to live with that tension. A global church rooted in ancient claims, operating in a modern environment that constantly questions authority, tradition, and moral teaching. Across all these centuries, the Catholic Church's story is not a single straight line. It is a long evolution shaped by empires and invasions, reform movements and internal conflict, cultural brilliance and public scandal, deep continuity and sudden rupture. Its institutions became resilient, partly because they adapted, and partly because they insisted on a stable core of belief and leadership. Whether approached as a faith community, a cultural force, or a political actor, it remains one of the most consequential structures in world history. By the 14th century, the relationship between spiritual authority and political power was under heavy strain in Western Europe. Rome, which had long been the symbolic centre of Catholic leadership, was also a city shaped by factional violence and unstable alliances. In that climate, the papacy made a dramatic move. The Pope established his residence not in Rome, but in the fortified city of Avignon in southern France. What followed was an era in which the seat of papal government operated at a distance from Italy, surrounded by French influence and watched closely by rival rulers across Europe. Even after the Pope returned to Rome, the crisis did not end. A deeper rupture followed when competing claimants each declared themselves the legitimate Pope. For decades, Europe lived with parallel papacies backed by different kingdoms, turning a spiritual office into a political battlefield. Eventually, a major council was called to end the deadlock. One by one, claimants were pressured to step aside or were removed from recognition, clearing the way for a single election and a restored sense of unity, at least on paper. Not long after, church leaders tried something even more ambitious, bridging the long divide between the Latin West and the Greek East. A grand meeting brought representatives together for intense debate about doctrine, authority, and long-standing misunderstandings. The public goal was reconciliation and reunion. The results were mixed. The split between Catholic and Orthodox Christianity did not disappear. But some Eastern communities entered communion with Rome, creating a patchwork of Eastern Catholic traditions that kept their own rituals and identity while recognizing papal leadership. It was an outcome that revealed both the reach of the papacy and the limits of negotiation, when theology, memory, and politics were entangled. Then the world widened. From the 15th century onward, European exploration connected continents with new trade routes, empires, and conflicts. Catholic expansion travelled with that wave, especially because the strongest maritime powers of the era were Catholic kingdoms. Missionaries accompanied explorers and conquerors, and new Catholic communities appeared in the Americas, parts of Africa, and across Asia and the Pacific. Yet this expansion was rarely simple evangelization. Colonial administration often shaped church life from the top down. In many regions, the crowns of European states gained enormous control over church appointments and institutions overseas. That meant local religious leadership and policies could be tied closely to imperial priorities, rather than being directed from Rome alone. In some places, Catholic identity became deeply rooted, blending with local languages and customs. In others, it became associated with conquest, forced labour systems, and political domination. Either way, the faith's global map was changing permanently. While Catholic influence spread outward, Europe itself moved toward internal fracture. Reform movements that had simmered for centuries ignited into open revolt in the early 16th century. A German monk challenged practices and teachings that many already questioned, including financial systems tied to forgiveness and the authority claimed by church leadership. The break escalated quickly, and it became impossible to contain as a narrow debate among theologians. New Protestant traditions formed, and the unity of Western Christianity shattered. Elsewhere, political rulers used the moment to reshape religion inside their own kingdoms. In England, the break took a distinctive path as the Crown claimed supreme authority over the national church, creating a new religious settlement that eventually developed into a separate tradition. Across Central Europe, alliances formed and collapsed, and religion became inseparable from questions of sovereignty, loyalty, and survival. The consequences were not merely ideological, they were violent and prolonged. In parts of the German-speaking lands, conflict grew into large-scale wars involving rival princes, imperial authority, and foreign interventions. In France, religious division fueled a cycle of civil wars, marked by massacres, repression, and shifting compromises. Periods of limited toleration appeared, then collapsed under pressure as rulers tried to impose unity by force. Catholic leaders responded with their own sweeping program of clarification and renewal. A major council defined doctrine more sharply, strengthened discipline, and attempted to reshape the training and behaviour of clergy. This Catholic response did not simply resist Protestantism. It reorganised Catholic life, improved institutional control, and fueled energetic missionary activity at home and abroad. The result was a Europe with hardened religious boundaries and a Catholic Church more centralised and assertive than before. By the 17th and 18th centuries, a different challenge rose, one aimed not only at doctrine, but at the social power religion held over public life. Philosophers and writers questioned inherited authority, mocked superstition, and attacked the privileges of clergy and the influence of the church on law, education, and politics. In some countries, rulers tried to subordinate the church to national interests, limiting Rome's influence and reshaping church institutions to serve the state. These pressures exploded most dramatically in revolutionary France. Churches were seized or destroyed. Religious orders were dissolved, and a new political culture tried to replace religious identity with civic ideology. Clergy and believers were persecuted, and the papacy itself was pulled into the turmoil of European warfare. In the era of Napoleon, the relationship shifted again. Harsh repression gave way to negotiated restoration in some areas, as new governments sought stability and legitimacy by reaching agreements with the Church. The 19th century brought further transformation, especially for the papacy's political role. For centuries, popes had ruled territory, not only souls. But as Italian nationalism gathered force, the old political map of the peninsula was rewritten. The papal state was absorbed into a unified Italy, and the pope's temporal rule collapsed. For a time, the papacy refused to accept the new arrangement and treated its position as one of confinement and protest. The standoff ended only when a treaty recognized a tiny sovereign enclave for papal government, allowing the Church to retain independence while abandoning the older model of territorial rule across central Italy. This shift did not weaken papal influence in religious terms. In some ways, it refocused it. Doctrines emphasizing papal authority were defined more strongly, and Catholic identity was increasingly framed around loyalty to Rome rather than loyalty to a papal kingdom. Meanwhile, European empires expanded deeper into Africa and Asia. Catholic missions often moved alongside colonial administrations. In many settings, missionaries provided education and medical care, but they also worked within structures built on inequality and coercion. Some defended local communities, others cooperated closely with imperial power, and many occupied an uneasy middle ground. The result was a complicated legacy. Catholic institutions became part of everyday life in many colonized regions, yet they were also linked to systems that limited local autonomy and imposed European cultural norms. In the 20th century, the Catholic Church faced a sequence of political storms unlike anything before. World War, totalitarian ideologies, and revolutionary regimes placed church leaders and believers in situations with no safe choices. Papal appeals for peace often fell flat amid national mobilization and propaganda. In some countries, anti-clerical governments tried to dismantle Catholic influence by law and force, closing churches, expelling clergy, and punishing public worship. In the communist world, religion was treated as a rival to state control, leading to arrests, surveillance, confiscation of property, and long campaigns to weaken church networks. In fascist and Nazi-occupied Europe, the Church's position varied widely by country and moment. Individual priests, religious orders, and lay networks sometimes became centers of resistance or rescue, while in other places church figures cooperated with authoritarian regimes. Whether out of ideological sympathy, fear of communism, or hopes of protecting institutional interests. The period also left a long moral argument about how much church leadership did or could have done to confront mass persecution and genocide, and how to weigh quiet diplomacy against public denunciation. After the war, the Cold War divided the continent and shaped Catholic life. In Eastern Europe, religious freedom was restricted, yet the Church often remained a major source of cultural identity and moral solidarity. In parts of Asia, new revolutionary governments expelled foreign missionaries and tried to build state-controlled religious structures. Catholic communities survived, but often under heavy state oversight, divided between underground loyalty to Rome and official institutions permitted by government policy. Across the same decades, Catholic demographics shifted as the faith grew rapidly in parts of Latin America, Africa, and Asia, while church attendance and public influence declined in much of Western Europe. In the 1960s, Catholic leadership launched a major effort to speak to a changing world. A global council modernized aspects of worship and encouraged wider participation, including greater use of local languages in the Mass. It promoted dialogue with other Christian traditions and called for improved relations with non-Christian religions, including Judaism. Supporters presented this as a long-needed opening, a way to make ancient rituals intelligible to modern societies and to shift the Church from defensive posture to engagement. Critics feared that the changes blurred tradition, weakened discipline, and created confusion about authority. The debate did not remain abstract. It reshaped parishes, schools, and the public image of Catholicism across the world. That era also intensified disputes over moral teaching, especially as new technologies and social movements challenged inherited norms around marriage, sexuality, and family life. Within Catholic circles, some argued for adaptation, while others insisted continuity mattered more than popularity. Church leadership reaffirmed long-standing positions, and the gap between official teaching and lived practice widened in many places. As the century continued, scandal and institutional failure, especially around abuse and accountability, created another crisis, one that did not come from outside critics alone, but from inside the Church's own communities, demanding reform, transparency, and justice. In the late 1970s, the Catholic Church entered a new era, and the change was visible immediately. In 1978, a man from behind the Iron Curtain was elected Pope. He had been a senior church leader in Krakow, living under a communist system that watched religious life closely. His election broke a long habit in Rome, because for centuries the papacy had almost always been held by Italians. He would remain in office for more than a quarter of a century, one of the longest reigns of any pope in the modern age, and his presence helped reshape the Church's relationship with politics, media, and global culture. From the beginning, this pope treated the role as a worldwide mission, rather than a position tied mainly to Rome. He travelled constantly, appearing in places that had rarely, if ever, seen a pontiff in person. He became a familiar face on television and radio, using mass communication to speak to believers who were drifting away in more secular societies and to communities living under censorship or state pressure. A signature feature of his public style was his direct outreach to young people. Large international gatherings were created around that idea, turning youth events into global spectacles that blended worship, pilgrimage, and media attention. In his social teaching, he repeatedly emphasized the dignity of work and argued that workers deserved fair treatment, safe conditions, and wages that allowed a stable life. At the same time, he strongly defended traditional moral positions, speaking against abortion and euthanasia, and increasingly urging restraint in the use of capital punishment. Under his leadership, the Church's public profile grew larger than it had been in decades, but so did the criticism. Late 20th century debates intensified over sexual ethics, the ban on ordaining women, and how church authorities responded to abuse scandals involving clergy. During this same period, the Vatican began to address certain symbolic disputes between faith and science. In the early 1990s, church officials acknowledged that earlier actions against Galileo had been wrong. The point was not only about a single historical case, but about how the modern church wanted to present itself in relation to inquiry, evidence, and the long memory of conflict between religious authority and intellectual life. After the death of that long-serving pope in 2005, his successor came from the senior ranks of Vatican leadership and had spent years overseeing doctrinal matters. He became widely associated with a more reserved public style and a determination to defend traditional belief against the pressures of secular culture. He also encouraged a broader space for older forms of worship that had been largely replaced after the reforms of the 1960s. Meanwhile, Catholic leaders worried that many believers in wealthy countries were slowly disconnecting from church life, not through dramatic rebellion but through indifference. Meetings of bishops focused on how to speak again to societies where religion no longer shaped daily identity. Then came an unexpected turning point. In 2013, this pope resigned, citing age and limitations. It was a rare act in modern history and immediately raised questions, admiration, and suspicion in different corners of the Catholic world. For most observers, it marked a practical decision in a demanding office, but a small minority refused to accept it as a complete withdrawal from the role. The next pope brought another historic shift. Chosen in 2013, he was the first pontiff from the Americas and the first in modern times from the Southern Hemisphere. His public image contrasted sharply with the careful formality of many predecessors. He was known for plain gestures, a focus on mercy, and frequent language about poverty and social margins. Environmental themes rose higher in church messaging under his leadership, and he presented interfaith dialogue as a priority rather than a side project. He also made visible efforts to ease long-standing tensions with Eastern Christianity. At his inauguration, an important Orthodox patriarch attended, a striking symbol after many centuries of distance. Later, the head of the Catholic Church met the Russian Orthodox Patriarch in a highly public encounter that was presented as a new stage of contact after nearly a millennium of separation. These moments did not erase deep disagreements, but they signalled that dialogue itself had become part of the modern papal toolkit. Inside the Church, controversy continued around marriage and family life. Bishops met to discuss how to serve Catholics whose personal situations did not fit neatly into official expectations, especially after divorce and remarriage without a church declaration that the first marriage was invalid. Some welcomed the discussion as a pastoral opening. Others feared that uncertainty would weaken clarity and discipline. Around the same period, relations with some ancient Eastern churches also saw practical gestures of recognition, including steps toward mutual acknowledgement of baptism in specific contexts. Later, the Pope also tightened the rules around older forms of the Roman liturgy, emphasizing a preference for the modern form of worship and limiting the broader permissions that had been granted earlier. Behind these headline moments sits a structure that has changed over centuries, but still carries a recognizable shape. The Catholic Church is governed through bishops. Each bishop oversees a defined territory, and within that territory are local communities that gather for worship and pastoral care. Priests serve these communities under the authority of the bishop, and deacons assist in preaching, charity, and service. Above this network stands the Bishop of Rome, commonly called the Pope, who is regarded as the central point of unity in the worldwide church. The Pope's governing apparatus is not just a personal staff. It is a complex administrative system that handles diplomacy, appointments, oversight, and coordination across continents. Alongside that, central government exists a layer of senior advisors known as cardinals. They are selected from prominent church leaders and serve in major roles. When a pope dies or resigns, cardinals of voting age gather in seclusion to elect a successor. In theory, the choice could fall on any suitable Catholic man, but in practice, modern popes are selected from within that group. The Church also operates with its own legal framework. This is not the same as state law. and it is not limited to theology. It sets procedures for governance, defines responsibilities, establishes courts, and regulates internal discipline. It also shapes how the Church recognizes marriage, administers institutions, and handles disputes. Different traditions within Catholicism follow different legal codes. The largest branch is the Western tradition, often called the Latin Church, which includes the great majority of Catholics worldwide. Alongside it are Eastern Catholic churches that share communion with Rome while preserving their own liturgies, calendars, and internal leadership patterns shaped by Eastern Christian history. Some are led by patriarchs or major archbishops, chosen through their own structures, and they remain connected to Rome without being culturally identical to the Western Church. Catholicism is one of the world's largest religious communities, second only to Sunni Islam by overall size. By the end of the 2010s, the number of baptized Catholics was commonly reported at well over 1 billion, making up a sizable share of the global population. The largest Catholic populations are found in the Americas and parts of Asia, with Brazil often cited as the single biggest national community. Mexico, the Philippines, and the United States also stand out. When Christians are counted as a whole, Catholics form roughly about half of that wider Christian world, though the exact proportions depend on how different churches measure membership. Over the last century, Catholic geography has been changing. Europe remains historically important, but the centre of gravity has been shifting southward. Growth in Africa has been especially striking, and Catholic communities across Latin America continue to shape the Church's public face. Asia holds a smaller share overall, yet it includes places where Catholicism has deep roots and strong public visibility. Oceania accounts for the smallest portion, but it still contains established Catholic networks and institutions. Seen from a distance, the pattern is clear. Catholicism today is not a primarily European story, even if many of its older institutions and symbols were formed there. This worldwide scale depends on a layered workforce that is not limited to priests. The most visible leaders are ordained clergy, including bishops, priests, and deacons. Bishops oversee regions and set priorities for local church life. Priests serve communities more directly, carrying out worship, teaching, and pastoral care. Deacons, many of them permanent deacons rather than future priests, assist in service and ministry in a wide range of settings. Alongside the ordained clergy stands a much larger group of non-ordained workers, catechists who teach the faith at the local level, lay missionaries who help sustain communities or launch new ones, and trained lay ministers who support parish life in education, charity work, and pastoral programs. In many parts of the world, especially where clergy are fewer, these lay roles are not optional extras. They are essential for daily religious life. Another major component is consecrated life, which includes men and women who commit themselves to a religious vocation rather than marriage. Many live in communities with shared rules and missions. Some work in schools, hospitals, shelters, and refugee services. Others focus on prayer, study, or contemplative life. These religious sisters and brothers are not automatically clergy, and many are not ordained at all, yet their impact on education, healthcare, and charity has been one of the defining features of modern Catholic history. Under the surface of organisation sits a set of beliefs that has developed over many centuries. Catholic teaching presents itself as anchored in early Christianity, while also responding to new disputes, cultural shifts, and ethical questions. Over time, church councils, papal decisions, and long theological arguments helped define what was considered faithful teaching and what was rejected as error. Catholicism also describes itself as guided in discernment by the Holy Spirit. and it claims a special protection from doctrinal failure when its highest teaching authority makes a final, formal decision on matters of faith and morals. In Catholic life, revelation is commonly described as coming from one divine source but being handed on in two closely linked ways. One is the Bible, which Catholic tradition recognizes as a fixed collection of sacred writings. The other is tradition, meaning the inherited teaching and practice passed down through generations from the earliest church. Scripture and tradition are treated as a single inheritance of faith, rather than two competing streams. Their official interpretation belongs to the Church's teaching office, exercised by the Pope together with the world's bishops in communion with him. For ordinary believers, much of this is summarized in official teaching guides, intended to present the faith as a coherent whole. At the center of Catholic belief is one God understood through the language of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. This is not presented as three gods, but as one divine reality expressed in three persons. Jesus Christ is identified as the Son, believed to be fully divine while also fully human. The story of his life, teaching, death, and resurrection stands at the core of Catholic identity. His execution by crucifixion is interpreted not simply as a tragedy, but as a decisive act meant to restore humanity's relationship with God. The resurrection is treated as the turning point that confirms his identity and transforms the meaning of death and hope for believers. In Catholic teaching, the mission of Jesus is not only something to admire from a distance, but something that continues to shape the world through worship, sacraments, and the moral life of the faithful. One of the long-standing theological fault lines between Western and Eastern Christianity concerns how the Holy Spirit is described as proceeding within the Trinity. The Western tradition came to express this in a way that emphasizes the Spirit's relation to both Father and Son, while many Eastern Christians preserved older Greek phrasing that avoided that addition. This difference became one symbol among many of deeper historical tensions, though believers and theologians have also worked to explain the two traditions in ways that reduce misunderstanding. Catholicism also makes strong claims about the nature of the Church itself. It describes the Church as the community founded by Jesus and guided by the Holy Spirit from the earliest days of the Apostles. The public launch of the Church is often tied to the moment when the Apostles began preaching openly after receiving spiritual empowerment. A major part of Catholic self-understanding is apostolic succession, the idea that bishops stand in an unbroken line of continuity reaching back to the Apostles. Within that framework, the Bishop of Rome is treated as holding a unique role as successor of Peter, a position associated with primacy and a universal responsibility for unity. From this perspective, the Church is not only an institution, but a living presence meant to carry forward the work of Christ. Its worship and sacraments are understood as more than symbolic ceremonies. They are seen as channels through which divine grace strengthens the believer and draws the community together. In Catholic life, the sacraments form a kind of spiritual architecture that marks the major passages of a human life: birth into the faith, growth, reconciliation, vocation, healing, and the bonds of family. Catholic teaching about the afterlife follows a structured picture of judgment and destiny. After death, each person is believed to face a personal reckoning before God, measuring life not only by actions, but by the state of the soul and the relationship to God. Beyond that individual judgment stands the idea of a final, universal judgment at the end of history, when the moral meaning of human life is fully revealed and creation is renewed. Within that framework, heaven is described as complete union with God and the fulfillment of human purpose. Purgatory is described as a temporary purification for those ultimately destined for heaven but still marked by attachment to sin. Hell is described as a definitive separation from God, understood as the outcome of a final refusal rather than an arbitrary sentence imposed from outside. At the same time, Catholic teaching makes room for complexity. It holds that God's mercy can reach people in ways that are not limited to the ordinary pathways of church life, even while insisting that salvation is ultimately connected to Christ. This creates a balance that often appears tense. On one side, the Church's claim to possess the fullness of the means of salvation. On the other, the recognition that elements of Christian truth exist outside its visible boundaries, and that people may be saved through extraordinary circumstances, sincere searching, or moral innocence shaped by conditions beyond their control. This is one of the areas where Catholic theology tries to speak in two registers at once: firm identity and cautious humility. The world of saints and devotions belongs to the emotional and cultural heart of Catholic life. A saint is not simply a historical hero, but someone believed to have lived with exceptional holiness, and now shares in the life of heaven. Early Christian memory honoured martyrs first, because their deaths were taken as the most dramatic witness to faith. Later, people admired for their lives of courage, charity, and spiritual discipline also came to be honoured. Official recognition of a saint is treated as a careful process, involving investigation, testimony, and long review. When recognition is granted, it authorises public veneration and allows the person to be invoked as an intercessor in public worship. Around this official framework grew a wide landscape of popular devotion. These practices are not the central liturgy itself, but they shape how people express faith in daily life. Pilgrimages, prayers, special feast days, and sacred images are part of a tradition that is both intensely local and unmistakably global. Such devotions have often been encouraged to remain connected to the rhythms of the liturgical year so that popular piety does not drift into a separate religion of its own. In practice, however, Catholic life has long included a constant interaction between formal worship and the emotional, imaginative devotion of ordinary believers. No figure is more central in Catholic devotion than Mary, the mother of Jesus. Catholic teaching speaks of her in a distinctive way: honoured without being treated as divine, venerated without replacing worship of God. She is called the Mother of God in the sense that she gave birth to Christ, who is believed to be both divine and human. Catholic tradition also emphasises her lifelong virginity and attributes to her a unique role in salvation history. Over time, the Church defined additional teachings about her, including the claim that she was preserved from original sin from the first moment of her existence, and the belief that at the end of her life she was taken into heavenly glory. These teachings became pillars of Catholic Marian identity, shaping art, prayer, and religious culture across continents. Marian devotion appears in many forms: short prayers known by heart, long cycles like the Rosary, hymns and processions, and major pilgrimage centres, connected to reported apparitions that the Church has judged worthy of belief. In many regions, these pilgrimages are as much social events as spiritual ones, gathering crowds that cross national and class boundaries. Whether one views these as expressions of faith, cultural memory, or both, they have become a defining part of Catholic public life. At the core of Catholic ritual life stand the 7 sacraments. They are described as visible actions that communicate grace, not merely reminders of it. Baptism marks entry into the Church. Confirmation is presented as strengthening that bond. The Eucharist is treated as the central act of worship in which bread and wine are consecrated and understood to become Christ's body and blood. Reconciliation offers forgiveness after sin through confession and absolution. Anointing of the sick brings prayer and comfort in illness and vulnerability. Holy orders forms clergy for service, and marriage is recognized as a sacramental bond shaping family life. These sacraments also operate within a careful system of rules and boundaries. Catholic teaching insists that a sacrament requires the correct form and intention to be valid, and it sets conditions for who may administer them and who may receive them. The Eucharist, in particular, is surrounded by discipline. Believers are expected to approach it with reverence, a clear conscience, and preparation. Those conscious of grave sin are told to seek reconciliation first. Fasting before communion remains a common expectation. Intercommunion with other Christian communities is generally restricted, though the approach can differ in special circumstances, especially in relation to some Eastern Christians whose sacraments the Catholic Church recognizes as valid, even when full communion is not present. In Catholic life, the sacraments are often described as milestones that shape a person's journey from entry into the faith to service, healing, and lifelong commitments. Some are tied to beginnings, some address weakness and recovery, and others shape the way people build families or dedicate their lives to the Church's work. Taken together, they form a framework that links private belief to visible actions and individual spirituality to a public community. The first step is baptism. In Catholic understanding, baptism is the doorway into Christian life. It is treated as a true beginning rather than a symbolic gesture, because it is believed to remove sin and place a person within the community of the Church. This includes what Catholic teaching calls original sin, as well as personal sins for anyone old enough to have committed them. Baptism is spoken of as a gift rather than a reward, which is why it is traditionally given even to infants. A child may not have personal guilt in the ordinary sense, but Catholic theology holds that baptism is still necessary as the foundational act that sets life in the faith in motion. Because baptism is considered essential, it is also treated with urgency in extreme circumstances. If a newborn is in immediate danger of death, the act is not reserved only to clergy. In such moments, the Church teaches that any person may baptize, including parents or medical staff, as long as the intention is to do what baptism is meant to do, and the words used reflect Christian belief in the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Once baptism takes place, it is understood to mark a person permanently. For that reason, it is not repeated, and the Church commonly recognizes baptisms performed outside Catholic settings when they follow that basic pattern. After baptism comes confirmation, which Catholic tradition presents as a strengthening and completion of what baptism begins. The emphasis is not on starting over, but on deepening the bond that has already been formed. In many places, adults who enter the Church receive confirmation soon after baptism, as part of one continuous initiation. In several Eastern Catholic communities, this completion is given even to infants, highlighting the idea that it belongs to the structure of initiation itself. In much of the Western practice, however, confirmation is often delayed until a person is older, sometimes so that the meaning can be consciously embraced, sometimes because local custom links it more closely to the bishop's pastoral oversight. The essential gesture in confirmation is anointing, using a specially blessed oil mixture that is treated as a sign of strengthening and dedication. The expectation is that the recipient approaches it seriously. Catholic teaching typically frames this as something best received while spiritually prepared, with a sincere intention to live the faith publicly rather than treating the rite as a social formality. It is presented as a sacrament that strengthens identity and responsibility, not simply a ceremonial graduation. The third point of initiation is the Eucharist. In Catholic worship, this is not presented as one sacrament among many, but as the central act that regularly gathers the community. The first time a Catholic receives it is often known as First Communion, and it becomes a recurring practice rather than a single life event. The Eucharist is celebrated within the main service of worship, commonly called Mass in the Latin tradition, while Eastern Catholics use their own ancient service forms and names. Within that liturgy, the structure moves through readings from Scripture, prayers, and the offering of bread and wine. Catholic belief holds that through a priest's consecration, these gifts become the body and blood of Christ. This is not framed as a metaphor in official teaching, but as a real change in what the elements are, even while their appearance remains bread and wine. The words spoken at the heart of the rite reflect the last meal Jesus shared with his disciples before his execution, linking the worship service to the story of the crucifixion. The Eucharist is also described as making present the one sacrifice of Christ, not repeating it as though it were unfinished, but presenting its power and meaning in every generation. Catholic teaching describes the effects of the Eucharist in several layers. It is believed to unite believers with Christ and with one another, to deepen spiritual life, and to strengthen moral resolve. It is also associated with forgiveness of lesser sins and a renewed call to holiness. At the same time, Catholic discipline treats it as something that demands reverence and honesty. Those conscious of grave sin are expected to seek reconciliation before receiving communion, because the act is meant to express real spiritual communion, not merely attendance or belonging. This moves directly into the sacraments that deal with healing. Two stand out as the Church's formal ways of addressing spiritual wounds and human fragility: reconciliation and anointing of the sick. Reconciliation is the sacrament tied to moral failure after baptism. It exists because, in Catholic teaching, baptism is not seen as eliminating human weakness, but as offering a new life that can still be damaged by sin. The ritual is structured around a set of human actions: self-examination, genuine sorrow, an honest confession, and a willingness to repair what can be repaired. The priest's role includes assigning a concrete act of penance as a form of spiritual remedy, and then pronouncing absolution. In Catholic life, serious sins are expected to be confessed, and the practice is also encouraged as a regular discipline, even for lesser faults, because it trains conscience and supports reform. One of the most distinctive features of this sacrament is confidentiality. The priest is expected to keep absolute secrecy about what has been confessed. This seal is treated as inviolable, because the act is understood not as a conversation for public use, but as a protected space for truth-telling and conversion. Anointing of the sick addresses a different kind of vulnerability. It is meant for those facing serious illness, severe decline through age, or danger of death. A priest uses blessed oil to anoint the person and offers prayers for strength, peace, and courage. The sacrament is associated with spiritual comfort, and in Catholic understanding, it can also involve forgiveness of sins for someone who cannot make a normal confession. Historically, it was often linked primarily with the final stage of life, which is why older language sometimes described it as a last anointing. In modern practice, it is more commonly framed as a sacrament for the seriously ill, not only for the dying, though it remains closely connected to the rites offered near the end of life. Beyond initiation and healing, Catholic tradition speaks of sacraments that serve the life of the wider community. Two are commonly highlighted here: holy orders and marriage. They are described as directed outward, because they shape people into roles meant to build up others, rather than focusing only on personal spiritual growth. Holy orders is the sacrament through which men are ordained for leadership and service in the Church. It is organized in 3 levels: Bishops stand at the highest level, responsible for teaching, governance, and overseeing the sacramental life of a region. Priests serve communities under a bishop's authority, celebrating the Eucharist and providing pastoral care. Deacons serve in assistance and ministry, often in preaching, charity, and community support. Catholic rules about ordination vary in certain details between traditions, but the priesthood and bishopric are reserved to men. In the Latin tradition, bishops are celibate, and priests are generally celibate, while some Eastern Catholic communities ordain married men as priests under established norms, though bishops remain celibate. Once ordained in the Catholic discipline, a priest is not free to marry, because ordination is treated as a permanent commitment to a particular form of life and service. Different clergy can do different things. Deacons can preach, baptize, witness marriages, and lead funeral services. Priests and bishops can celebrate the Eucharist, hear confessions, and anoint the sick. Only bishops ordain others into holy orders. This structure reinforces a central Catholic idea. Sacraments are not only personal experiences, but actions of the Church carried out through defined roles. Marriage, in Catholic teaching, is not only a social contract but a spiritual bond. It is described as a lifelong union between a man and a woman, ordered toward the good of the spouses and the welcoming of children. Sexual life is framed as properly belonging within that covenant. When both spouses are baptized, the marriage is treated as sacramental. Once fully established, it is understood as a bond that ends only with death. For a marriage to be considered valid, Catholic teaching insists on genuine freedom of consent and other essential conditions. Catholics are also expected to follow specific rules when marrying, including the required form and the presence of a qualified witness, reflecting the view that marriage is not merely private, but part of the Church's public life. Divorce is treated differently in Catholic theology than in many modern legal systems. Civil divorce may be accepted as a legal tool to protect people and property in difficult situations, but it is not regarded as ending a valid sacramental marriage. The Church does, however, investigate claims that a supposed marriage lacked something essential from the beginning. If an investigation concludes that a true marriage bond never existed due to a serious defect of consent or another foundational issue, the Church may declare the union invalid. In everyday speech, this is often called an annulment, though the concept is closer to a judgment about the past than permission to break a bond that once existed. All of these sacraments are celebrated within a larger world of worship that varies across Catholic communities. Catholicism is not limited to one style of liturgy. Alongside the Latin tradition, there are Eastern Catholic churches with their own ancient rites, calendars, music, and prayer patterns. These differences are not presented as competing faiths, but as distinct cultural and historical expressions of the same core belief. The Eucharist remains the central act everywhere, yet the way it is prayed can look very different from place to place. Over time, some Eastern communities adopted Western practices, while more recent reforms encouraged them to reclaim older traditions and express their identity more fully. In the Latin world, the most widely used form of worship is the Roman Rite, commonly celebrated in local languages. Older forms remain part of Catholic memory and are still used in some places under current rules, though Church leadership has repeatedly emphasized unity and clarity in how worship is celebrated. Special communities also exist that use adapted liturgical forms shaped by their own history, showing that Catholic worship is both ancient and living, anchored in inherited patterns, while still responding to changing circumstances. Catholic social thought is built around a simple claim. Faith is not only about private belief, but also about responsibility toward other people, especially those who suffer. Across its preaching and public statements, the Church repeatedly returns to care for the sick, the poor, and those pushed to the margins. This concern is not presented as optional charity, but as a duty. In Catholic language, special attention is often directed toward those with the least power and the fewest resources, and believers are urged to support justice rather than only offering short-term relief. In the modern era, one of the turning points for this social emphasis came with 19th century debates over industrial labour. As factories expanded and urban poverty became more visible, major church writings defended the dignity of work and argued that workers should not be treated as disposable parts of an economy. The right to fair wages, safe conditions, and organised representation emerged as key themes. Over time, Catholic institutions translated these ideas into practice through schools, hospitals, shelters, and aid networks that operate alongside governments, but are not controlled by them. Environmental responsibility has also become part of this social focus. Recent church teaching has framed ecological damage as more than a technical problem, linking it to lifestyles built on waste, constant consumption, and short-term profit. Pollution, habitat loss, and a warming climate are described as symptoms of deeper choices about how societies value nature and people. In this view, the burdens often fall heaviest on poorer communities, those with fewer protections, and countries least able to adapt. Care for the environment is therefore described not only as green policy, but as a moral question tied to human dignity and the common good. Alongside social action, the Church's moral teaching on sexuality remains one of its most contested areas, especially in societies that changed rapidly during the late 20th century. Catholic teaching calls for chastity according to one's state of life. For unmarried people, that means abstaining from sexual activity. For married couples, it means faithfulness and a view of sexual intimacy as part of a committed relationship, rather than a purely private choice. The Church frames sexuality as something that involves both body and spirit, and it argues that sexual activity belongs within marriage. Within marriage, Catholic teaching places special weight on openness to life. Sexual intimacy is described as having two inseparable dimensions: the bonding of the couple and the possibility of bringing forth children. Because of that framework, the Church rejects contraception and certain other sexual practices, while allowing methods that rely on understanding fertility cycles to space births for serious reasons. In recent decades, Catholic leaders have also acknowledged that public debate can become narrowly focused on sexual rules, and some have urged a broader view that puts mercy, human struggle, and social responsibility back into the centre of pastoral life. Marriage, in Catholic understanding, is not treated as a contract that can be ended at will, but as a lifelong bond. Civil divorce may be recognised by states, yet church teaching distinguishes legal status from spiritual reality. When a marriage between baptised persons is considered valid and fully established, it is viewed as enduring. At the same time, the Church does investigate cases where people claim that a true marriage was never formed from the start because an essential condition was missing, such as real consent or freedom from serious impediments. In such cases, a church tribunal can reach a judgment that the marriage was invalid from the beginning. In limited situations involving marriages where one or both spouses were not baptized, a dissolution may also be possible under specific conditions. These distinctions are complex, and they often become emotionally charged because they touch family life, identity, and belonging. Bioethics has become another major arena of controversy. the Church opposes abortion and rejects reproductive technologies it believes separate conception from the marital act or risk treating embryos as disposable. It also resists practices it sees as reducing human life to a product of technique. These views shape Catholic engagement with medical policy and public debate, especially in countries where healthcare and law are closely tied to cultural battles. Vaccination raised new arguments in the modern period, especially when some vaccines were connected indirectly to historic cell lines, derived from aborted fetal tissue. Official Catholic statements in recent years have generally drawn a distinction between direct participation in wrongdoing and distant, passive connections that a person does not choose and cannot control. In that reasoning, receiving a vaccine may be considered morally permissible when serious public danger exists and no practical alternative is available, while still affirming opposition to abortion. Those who refuse such vaccines on conscience grounds are often urged to take other strong measures to reduce harm to others, especially the vulnerable. Questions of same-sex relationships form another area where official teaching and public culture often clash. Catholic doctrine distinguishes between a person's dignity and moral judgments about sexual acts. It calls for respect and rejects unjust discrimination, while maintaining that sexual activity belongs within marriage as defined by the Church. This tension has led to ongoing debate, including disputes about tone, pastoral practice, and the gap between institutional language and lived experience in many societies. Another long-running issue concerns the ordination of women. Women have been central to Catholic life for centuries, through religious communities and lay leadership, shaping education, healthcare, social service, prayer, and mission work. Yet the priesthood and the office of bishop remain restricted to men in Catholic law and teaching. Efforts to change this have repeatedly met formal rejection from church leadership, and attempts at unauthorized ordinations have been treated by the institution as invalid and subject to canonical penalties. The argument continues in public, but the official position has remained consistent. No contemporary account of the Catholic Church can avoid the crisis of sexual abuse. From the late 20th century onward, investigations and court cases revealed patterns of abuse by some clergy and failures by some leaders to respond adequately. Several cases accused priests were moved rather than removed, allowing harm to continue. Public outrage grew as victims described not only abuse itself, but also silence, delay, and institutional self-protection. In response, many countries saw new policies designed to prevent abuse, improve reporting, and impose clearer procedures. Oversight, bodies were created, and safeguarding became a public priority. Yet criticism has not disappeared, with victim advocates often arguing that reforms have been uneven and accountability still incomplete. Chivalry is often imagined as a fixed medieval rulebook, but it was never that simple. What later generations call the chivalric code was more like a shifting set of expectations that took clearer shape in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. It grew out of the world of mounted warriors and the social class that trained for war from childhood. Over time, that warrior lifestyle was wrapped in ideas about honor, religious duty, and refined behavior at court until being a knight came to mean more than riding well and fighting hard. Stories helped do much of that work. Medieval audiences heard tales about heroic companions serving great kings, about celebrated battles, daring rescues, loyalty tested in impossible circumstances, and devotion to ladies and lords. These narratives were repeated so often that many people treated them almost like history, even when they were shaped by imagination and moral lessons. The legends around Charlemagne's champions and the famous cycle of Arthur and the Round Table became cultural mirrors, reflecting what society wanted warriors to be, not necessarily what warriors always were. Much later, as historical research became stricter, scholars began separating literary ideals from documentary reality, and the golden age of chivalry started to look less like a real era and more like a powerful myth. At the beginning, the language of chivalry pointed to horses and the men who fought from the saddle. A knight was above all someone able to equip himself for heavy warfare, a warhorse, armour, and the expensive tools of combat. Yet even in the medieval period, words drifted. Knight gradually became an identity and a status, not only a battlefield role. As romances and court culture spread, the mounted fighter was increasingly expected to display courtesy, self-control, generosity, and a kind of public moral seriousness. Honour became a social currency. Reputation mattered. A warrior's standing could rise with courage and loyalty and collapse with cowardice or betrayal. By the late Middle Ages, chivalry was often described as a moral blend. The ethos of a fighter, the manners of a courtier, and the piety of a Christian noble. This mix was never perfectly consistent. Some ideals pulled in different directions. A code that praised mercy could sit uneasily beside a culture of raids and revenge. A worldview that celebrated humility before God could clash with a lifestyle built on pride of arms. Even so, chivalry functioned as a language of justification. It explained why a warrior elite should hold power and land. It also offered rules for how that power ought to look when performed in public. Writers tried to capture these expectations in advice books and moral guides. Different authors emphasized different features, and their portraits did not always agree. Some framed knighthood as a sacred calling with rituals and spiritual discipline. Others highlighted skill and daring above everything, treating battlefield performance as the true proof of worth. Still others leaned toward etiquette and the social art of serving a lord, hosting guests, speaking well, and showing restraint. Taken together, these sources reveal a pattern. Chivalry was presented as a way of life where war, social rank, and religion were braided into a single identity. Later, commentators sometimes turned chivalry into a list of commandments, as if the medieval world had once followed a neat set of rules. Those simplified lists tend to say more about the era that wrote them than the era they describe. Modern historians are generally cautious with such reconstructions, because they often flatten messy realities into a clean moral poster. The medieval record shows something more complicated. Codes existed, but they were argued over, bent, and broken. This is where the gap between literary chivalry and historical behaviour becomes impossible to ignore. Many people long believed there had been a true age of chivalry, a lost time when noble warriors consistently acted with perfect virtue. Yet when historians search for that golden age, it keeps sliding backward, placed first in one heroic period, then another, always just out of reach. The more closely court records, chronicles, and legal disputes are examined, the clearer it becomes that the polished image of chivalry belongs largely to the world of storytelling. Romance writers created an ideal realm of noble devotion, heroic loyalty, and refined love, while real society displayed brutality, corruption, and the hard mathematics of power. That does not mean chivalry was meaningless. Ideals can shape behaviour even when they are not fully obeyed. Chivalry offered a vocabulary that knights used to praise themselves, shame rivals, and set standards for public conduct. It also became a tool used by institutions that wanted to control violence. Both kings and church leaders had reasons to guide and restrain warrior culture. Kings aimed to strengthen authority over private wars, feuds, and rivalries that threatened public order. Church leaders aimed to tame a fighting class whose values often ran ahead of Christian teaching. Attempts to reform knighthood never erased violence, but they did influence how violence was explained, when it was considered legitimate and what honourable conduct should look like. Before chivalry was clearly labelled and celebrated, there were already expectations surrounding noble behaviour. Earlier, warrior elites prized loyalty because it kept a military household together. They valued self-control because reckless aggression could tear alliances apart. Hardiness mattered because endurance and fearlessness decided survival. Generosity carried social weight because a noble leader was expected to reward followers, host guests, and prove that wealth did not own him. Alongside these traits ran a protective ideal. The strong should defend the weak, uphold justice, and curb abuses of power. Whether society lived up to that standard is another question, but the standard itself had deep roots. Honour tied all of this together. In a world where reputation could open doors or close them forever, honour was treated as something worth more than comfort, sometimes even more than life. Public disgrace, especially cowardice in battle, could destroy a man's standing beyond repair. That fear of dishonour helped enforce courage and loyalty, even when compassion and restraint were harder to maintain. Chivalry is often pictured as a timeless set of noble rules, but it actually took shape in a specific place and time. Many of its most recognisable features crystallised in northern France in the middle of the 12th century, then spread outward as European courts, armies, and storytellers adopted the image of the knight as a model of status and behaviour. This new figure was tied to changing social ranks, evolving battlefield methods, and a booming culture of heroic literature. The knight was not only a fighter on horseback, he was increasingly expected to embody a public ethos. How to serve a lord, how to behave among peers, and how to present violence as disciplined rather than chaotic. At the centre of this ethos stood loyalty. A knight's prestige depended on recognised bonds, service to an overlord, obligations within a hierarchy, and the expectation that promises had weight. Rules of war were never perfectly followed, but they were discussed, praised, and sometimes enforced within elite circles. One of the clearest examples was the preference for capturing high-born opponents, when possible. A noble prisoner could be ransomed, and ransom culture turned battle into a grim form of negotiation. It also reinforced the idea that elite enemies belonged to the same social universe, even when they tried to kill each other. Alongside that logic came a moral claim. Striking a defenseless opponent was portrayed as dishonourable, at least in the idealised version of noble combat. Even as these ideals took hold, martial training never stopped being the foundation. Chivalry was not primarily about polite manners. It was built on skill, stamina, and fearlessness. The practice yard, the riding ground, and the weapons drill remained central for centuries. Yet warfare itself gradually changed. As late medieval and early modern armies leaned more heavily on professional infantry, paid troops, and new technologies, the traditional battlefield role of the armoured horseman narrowed. The knightly identity did not vanish, but it increasingly migrated into controlled arenas. Tournaments, formal duels, and ceremonial displays. For a long time, the joust remained the clearest stage on which a knight could demonstrate speed, timing, courage, and mastery of the horse. Even into the Renaissance, public tilts still drew crowds and prestige, long after the battlefield had begun to favour other kinds of soldiers. The knight's training also spilled into elite leisure, especially hunting. The hunt was not merely entertainment, it was a rehearsal of command, endurance, tracking, and coordinated action. It became one of the signature rituals of courtly life, complete with specialised vocabulary, strict etiquette, and a sense that competence in the field reflected fitness for leadership. As chivalry became more visible, so did its symbols. Heraldry rose with it, coats of arms, badges, and rules for how identity should be displayed. These emblems served practical purposes in war and tournament, but they also turned lineage and reputation into visual language. A shield was no longer only protection. It was a statement about who a person was, who his allies were, and what kind of honor he claimed. Religion shaped this world as well, often in complicated ways. Church leaders were not automatically comfortable with warrior culture, yet they also recognized that fighting could not simply be wished away. Efforts emerged to restrain violence and protect vulnerable groups by setting limits on when and how warfare should be carried out. Over time, ideas developed that framed certain conflicts as morally defensible, especially when presented as defense of faith or protection of communities. Rituals and blessings gave the warrior role a sacred coating, and the image of the armed defender could be portrayed as a vocation rather than a problem. Stories reinforced that confidence, presenting the knight's life as something that could be pleasing to God if it was disciplined and aimed at a higher purpose. In that atmosphere, the language of the soldier of Christ gained popularity in parts of Europe. The idea suggested that knighthood could be more than social status. It could be a religious calling. This mindset reached a dramatic intensity during the Crusades, when fighting was often wrapped in spiritual meaning and presented as a holy enterprise. Military orders, combining monastic discipline with warfare, embodied the most literal form of that fusion. Yet the relationship between crusading and chivalry was never identical. Crusades influenced the moral vocabulary of knighthood, but chivalry also covered many aristocratic behaviours that had nothing to do with holy war, local feuds, dynastic struggles, tournaments, court politics, and the daily performance of rank. Chivalry was also shaped by cultural contact. In medieval Iberia, long coexistence and conflict between Islamic and Christian realms created channels for ideas, stories, and aesthetics to move across boundaries. Courtly poetry, refined speech, ideals of elegant bearing, and tales of brave champions circulated through multilingual societies. Western European writers drew inspiration from many directions, and the ideal knight increasingly carried not only martial strength but also a polished style, eloquence, self-control, and grace under pressure. This was less a simple borrowing than a process of absorption and remixing inside courts that were hungry for new forms of prestige. Ancient models mattered too. Medieval thinkers admired Roman military writing and used it to discuss discipline, strategy, and the ethics of war. Manuals and treatises were adapted, translated, and reworked, giving aristocratic warfare a scholarly sheen. Late medieval authors tried to reconcile battlefield necessity with moral claims, asking what rules should govern violence and what conduct deserved honour. In these works, chivalry becomes not just a storybook code but a field of argument. What should be permitted, what should be condemned, and how a warrior ought to justify his actions. Over time, chivalry spread beyond the old warrior aristocracy. Wealthy non-nobles began to imitate elite manners, sending sons into noble households to learn court behaviour. Books appeared to teach gentle conduct, how to speak, dress, show restraint, treat guests, and display honour in public life. In that process, chivalry helped create a broader ideal of the gentleman, a man measured not only by birth or combat ability, but by manners, reputation, and a public claim to decency. The code itself is often described in overlapping duties. One set focuses on obligations to one's community and fellow believers: courage, mercy, fairness, protection of the weak, and loyalty to rightful authority. Another set emphasizes duty to God. Devotion, moral discipline, defense of innocence, and the belief that justice has a sacred dimension. A third set centers on conduct toward women. Courtesy, restraint, and the stylized devotion often associated with courtly love. In practice, these categories mixed constantly. Different societies and different writers emphasized different parts, producing multiple versions of chivalry rather than one universal system. Late medieval war put the ideal under pressure. Large battles increasingly showcased the effectiveness of massed infantry, disciplined formations, and missile troops against heavily armored nobles. The heroic charge did not always win, and the social meaning of warfare began to shift. At the same time, rebellions and uprisings reminded elites that chivalric honor did not guarantee social stability. Professional soldiers and mercenary companies grew more prominent, and military leadership could rise from backgrounds that had little reason to obey aristocratic codes. In response, chivalry sometimes retreated further into ceremony. Elaborate etiquette, pageantry, and nostalgic performance of an ideal past, even as real warfare became harsher and more practical. As the medieval era gave way to early modern states, chivalry weakened as a battlefield ethic, but persisted as a cultural memory. Titles of knighthood survived, and rulers continued creating orders of honor to reward service and loyalty. Yet the ideal began to look old-fashioned, especially as new political and military realities demanded different kinds of discipline. Literature also turned critical. Satire mocked the warrior who tried to live by outdated romance rules in a world that had moved on, exposing the gap between heroic fantasy and modern life. Even so, chivalry never completely disappeared. Elements of it carried into officer culture, dueling traditions, and codes of honor among elites, well beyond the Middle Ages. In different countries and centuries, chivalry became a word people used to praise courage, courtesy, and protection of the vulnerable, even when the original knightly world was long gone. Romantic movements later revived medieval aesthetics and ideals, treating the knight as a symbol of purity and noble feeling. At the same time, critics argued that there was never just one chivalry. There were many versions shaped by war, religion, class, literature, and local custom. The Crusades were not a single war, but a long chain of campaigns that reshaped medieval Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. They were launched under the authority of the Latin Church and framed as sacred warfare. Yet they also drew in politics, ambition, local rivalries, and economic interests. The best-known expeditions aimed for the Eastern Mediterranean and focused on Jerusalem and its surrounding region. But the idea of crusade expanded over time. Fighting in Iberia against Muslim powers, campaigns in Northern Europe against pagan peoples, and later church-approved wars against groups labelled heretical or politically hostile were all folded into the same broad tradition. Alongside official efforts, crowds sometimes mobilized on their own, moving without formal leadership and leaving violence and chaos in their wake. By the late 11th century, the Eastern Mediterranean had entered a period of sharper instability. Earlier centuries had seen large-scale, territorial expansion slow down, and some regions enjoyed long stretches of relative prosperity. Yet power balances were never fixed. The Byzantine Empire had competitors on multiple frontiers, from raiders and rival states in the Balkans to shifting threats in Anatolia. In the Middle East, new waves of Turkic migration changed the political map. The Seljuk Turks, recent converts to Islam who had risen rapidly, pushed into Iran, Iraq, and the Levant. Their arrival intensified rivalry between Sunni and Shiite powers, especially in Syria and Palestine, where control could shift quickly and violently. A key rupture came with the Byzantine defeat at Manzikert in 1071. The emperor's loss and capture signalled more than a battlefield failure. It opened the door to deeper pressures in Anatolia and shook confidence in the empire's ability to control its eastern lands. Around the same period, Jerusalem itself changed hands as Turkish forces pushed into the region, and reports circulated in the West that pilgrims faced rising danger and that Eastern Christians were suffering under new rulers. Whether these stories were uniform or exaggerated, they mattered because they shaped how Western audiences imagined the East. As a sacred landscape under threat, and as a place where violence against fellow Christians demanded response. The decisive spark came in 1095. Pope Urban II called for a major campaign, presenting it as an armed pilgrimage with spiritual rewards. At the same time, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I sought military help against Turkish advances. Those two needs met in a single moment. An appeal from Constantinople for soldiers, and a papal vision that placed Western arms under a religious banner. The response in Western Europe crossed social boundaries. Nobles, knights, lesser lords, and common people were drawn by overlapping motives: devotion, fear for the holy places, the hope of forgiveness, the pull of adventure, the desire for status, and the possibility of profit. The movement offered a rare promise: religious meaning combined with public glory. The first wave was not an organized army but a mass movement. Preachers rallied crowds and thousands set out with limited planning, weak supplies, and little discipline. This People's Crusade became infamous for tragedy. As groups moved through parts of the Rhineland, violence erupted against Jewish communities, producing massacres that revealed how easily sacred rhetoric could be redirected toward nearby targets. For many participants, the logic was brutally simple. If enemies of the faith existed close at hand, why travel across continents first? That thinking turned religious fervour into local catastrophe. When these crowds reached the fringes of Anatolia, they met the realities of war. Light cavalry tactics and ambushes destroyed large portions of the poorly armed crusaders. Their defeat did not end the movement. It cleared the stage for the second, more decisive phase, the arrival of major aristocratic leaders, with trained fighters. The main expedition that followed was not a single unified army. It was a coalition of contingents tied together by personal bonds, regional loyalties, and rival ambitions. Leaders from northern and southern France, the Low Countries, the German regions, and Italy arrived in Byzantium in waves. Alexios received them cautiously, balancing the need for help with fear that these heavily armed visitors might become a threat. He pressed for oaths that captured cities would be returned to Byzantine control, and some leaders agreed, though the meaning of those pledges would soon be contested. The first major target was Nicaea, a Seljuk stronghold. With pressure from the Crusaders and strategic coordination by Byzantium, the city fell in 1097. This moment became one of the high points of cooperation between Latin and Greek forces. Yet even in victory, distrust grew. Each side suspected the other of withholding spoils or manipulating outcomes, and the partnership began to fray as the Crusaders moved deeper into Anatolia. Soon after, Crusader forces experienced the shock of Turkish battlefield methods at Dorylaeum. Mounted archers harassed and encircled, testing whether heavy cavalry could survive sustained pressure. The Crusaders endured a crisis until reinforcements arrived and the battle ended with Turkish withdrawal. For the Western armies, it was a warning. Skill, logistics, and unity mattered as much as zeal. The long march towards Syria brought starvation, thirst, disease, and desertion. The expedition's internal tensions sharpened as leaders made independent moves. One of the most consequential was the carving out of a new lordship in Edessa, which became the First Crusader state. It showed a truth that would define the entire crusading era. The expedition was not only about reaching Jerusalem, it was also about building power, securing territory, and creating new political orders in a contested world. The next great struggle was Antioch. The siege lasted months and pushed the Crusaders near collapse. Supplies ran low, morale fell, and the city could not be fully surrounded. Eventually, a breach came not through overwhelming force but through negotiation and betrayal. An opened gate allowed entry. What followed was slaughter and chaos, including violence that struck not only Muslim inhabitants, but also Eastern Christians caught inside the city's fractured communities. Then, the Crusaders themselves became the besieged, as a relief army arrived to retake Antioch. The moment could have ended the expedition, but the Crusaders rallied and launched a desperate counterattack. Internal divisions in the opposing force and the Crusaders' determination helped turn the tide, and the relief army withdrew. Victory did not bring unity. Crusader leaders argued over spoils and authority, delaying the march south. Hunger and violence spread into the surrounding countryside, and the movement's moral claims were stained by brutality, including reports of extreme acts committed under famine conditions. Yet the strategic situation pushed them onward. Jerusalem had shifted into Fatimid hands from Egypt, and the Crusaders feared that delay would allow stronger defences. The coalition moved south along the coast, advancing toward the city that had become the heart of the entire enterprise. In 1099, Jerusalem was besieged. The first assaults faltered, but new materials and skilled labour, arriving through coastal connections, made the difference. Siege engines were built, walls were breached, and the city fell. The conquest was followed by massacre and plunder, an episode that left a deep mark on memory and intensified the hatred and fear on all sides. Soon after, an Egyptian relief force was defeated near Ascalon, stabilizing the Crusaders' position, at least temporarily. With Jerusalem taken, the question became governance. Many participants considered their vows complete and returned home. The remaining leaders faced the problem of ruling a land with few troops, surrounded by enemies, and divided by rival claims. One leading figure accepted authority in Jerusalem while avoiding the royal title, emphasizing the sacred character of the city. The choice reflected a tension that would persist. Was this a spiritual domain that should be controlled by clergy, or a political kingdom that required secular leadership? Meanwhile, the wider Islamic world did not initially respond as a single, united front. Regional rivalries, sectarian divisions, and leadership struggles prevented immediate coordination. In Syria and Iraq, competing powers fought among themselves. In Egypt, the Fatimids pursued their own interests. Turkish rulers were split by succession conflicts. This fragmentation created a window in which the Crusader states could consolidate, build fortifications, and establish administrative systems. It also shaped Western perceptions, encouraging the belief that long-term survival was possible. The Crusaders established multiple states: Edessa, Antioch, Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Yet their hold on the region remained fragile. The death of the early leader in Jerusalem triggered a political crisis. Clerical leaders pushed to strengthen church authority over the city, while secular lords insisted that survival required a king with military power. In the end, the crown was placed on the head of a ruler linked to Edessa, and Jerusalem became a formal kingdom. This decision stabilized leadership, but did not solve the deeper problem. There were never enough soldiers. Most crusaders had gone home, leaving a thin defensive line stretched across hostile territory. In the early years, the Crusader kingdom faced threats from multiple directions. Muslim powers to the north and south tested borders and probed weaknesses. Byzantine relations remained uneasy, coloured by mistrust over oaths and claims. Leadership disputes continued, and ambitious nobles sought their own principalities. The crusading movement had achieved its most famous success, but it immediately entered a new phase, less like a single pilgrimage and more like a long struggle to maintain settler states in a region where alliances shifted and enemies adapted. After Jerusalem fell, to the first crusading armies, the new Latin foothold in the region looked far less secure than it appeared in celebratory stories back home. Too many fighters had already returned to Europe, leaving small garrisons stretched across hostile terrain. News of this fragile situation reached Rome, and the papacy encouraged another movement east. What followed is often treated as a continuation of the first expedition, rather than a completely separate crusade. A loose second wave that reached the Byzantine capital in stages, and then tried to push into Anatolia and Syria. Instead of a single army marching under one banner, it came as several major groups, each with its own leaders, rivalries, and priorities, converging on Constantinople across the winter of 1100 and the spring of 1101. One of the earliest contingents formed in northern Italy, drawing heavily from Lombardy and moving under prominent church leadership. In the Byzantine capital, this force linked up with a German element connected to imperial circles. A second large contingent arrived from central France, while a third brought together men from northern France, Flanders, and Burgundy under well-known aristocratic commanders, including figures who had already tasted the hardships of the earlier crusade and were now returning to repair reputations or fulfill unfinished vows. A fourth wave, with fighters from Aquitaine combined with Germans from the south of the empire, took a different route through Hungary and reached Constantinople later, after tensions and occasional clashes on the long road east. The overall scale looked impressive on paper, but the expedition lacked what the First Crusade had briefly possessed: a sense of shared direction and a workable plan for crossing Asia Minor. Waiting in Anatolia was an opponent who had learned from the disaster of 1097. The Seljuk ruler of Rum had lost Nicaea, yet he remained dangerous, and he was not alone. Other Turkish powers in the region, including rival dynasties and local princes, joined the struggle when opportunity appeared. The Crusaders advanced into territory where light cavalry, ambush, and speed mattered more than the slow, heavy style many Western knights preferred. In late summer, 1101, the main clash came near Mercivan. Fighting dragged on for days, wearing down men already exhausted by heat, hunger, and confusion. When the Crusader camp was finally overrun, the collapse was brutal. Mounted nobles escaped in small groups, but the people left behind paid the price. Non-combatants, clergy, and the vulnerable were killed or driven into slavery. The defeat scattered survivors northward toward Byzantine lands, and the expedition's unity broke apart at the moment it was needed most. Other contingents suffered similar destruction. A French force was cut to pieces near Heraclea, with only a handful escaping. The Aquitanian and Bavarian army reached the same region later in the year and met the same fate. Commanders slipped away, wounded in body and reputation. A noblewoman travelling with the host vanished during the chaos and never returned to the historical record. By the time the remnants staggered back toward Constantinople, the message was clear. The Crusaders could be shattered, and quickly. The second wave did not reinforce the Latin states. Instead, it fed thousands of lives into Anatolia and proved to Muslim powers that the victory of 1099 did not mean Western armies were unstoppable. Behind the scenes, a separate drama also shaped this period: the capture and ransom of a major Crusader prince. His earlier campaign had ended in captivity, and freeing him became an obsession for some Westerners, especially those who believed his return could stabilize the northern Crusader frontier. Yet the rulers of Jerusalem and Antioch did not treat his rescue as an emergency on the same level as defending their own borders and building institutions. Byzantium weighed the situation differently, seeing ransom negotiations as leverage in a larger contest for influence. Turkish rivals also used the captive as a bargaining chip, arguing over who would take the money and who would gain advantage. In the end, he was released through a deal that satisfied no one completely. He returned to Antioch and resumed power, but the episode revealed how fragmented Crusader politics had become, and how easily outside powers could exploit those fractures. While these failures unfolded, the Kingdom of Jerusalem began the hard work of consolidation. Its first king spent his reign trying to turn a conquest into a functioning state, balancing shortage of manpower against constant pressure from surrounding powers. To the south, the Fatimid government in Egypt sought to reverse the losses of 1099 and restore its hold on Palestine. The fighting around Ramla became a brutal measure of how close the kingdom came to collapse. One battle ended narrowly in the Franks' favour, but a later engagement brought a severe defeat, killing experienced nobles and leaving the road to Jerusalem dangerously exposed. Only after emergency regrouping and a hard-won recovery did the kingdom survive the crisis. Another clash near Ramla later in the decade weakened the Egyptian threat for a time, buying the Latin state a breathing space it would use to seize ports and strengthen its coastline. As pressure from Egypt eased, dangers from the north became more complicated. The Muslim world around Syria and Iraq was not unified under one command. Aleppo, Damascus, and Mosul were centers of power with competing rulers, shifting alliances, and constant internal struggle. Commanders rose and fell quickly, and military leadership often depended on personal ambition as much as religious ideology. For the Crusader states, this division was both a blessing and a danger. It prevented an immediate single counterattack, but it also meant threats could come from multiple directions without warning. Assassinations added another layer of instability as secretive factions targeted prominent leaders, turning politics into a landscape where sudden murder could redirect entire campaigns. In the north, Antioch pursued its own course, frequently at odds with Byzantine expectations. Its regent expanded into nearby regions and fought to control strategic corridors, while other Crusader leaders tried to build a fourth Latin state around Tripoli. That project unfolded slowly, shaped by sieges, castle building, and uneasy compromises. The struggle ended with the fall of Tripoli and the creation of a county that completed the familiar map of Latin Outremer: Jerusalem in the south, Antioch in the north, Edessa inland, Tripoli along the coast between them. Yet this map was never stable. Power moved with ransoms, deaths, and sudden defeats. One of the most damaging setbacks came at Harran, where armies from Edessa and Antioch met Turkish forces linked to Mosul and regional commanders. The Crusaders lost, and key leaders were captured. The aftermath became a long story of imprisonment, bargaining, shifting custodians, and ransom negotiations that dragged on for years. Deals were attempted and broken, hostages were moved from fortress to fortress, and political calculation often mattered more than solidarity. Even when prisoners were eventually freed, the price was steep in money, territory, and prestige. These cycles of capture and ransom became a defining feature of the period, showing that medieval warfare in the region was as much about bargaining power as it was about battlefield victory. At the same time, a new type of institution began to take shape in the Latin East: the military religious order. These groups combined monastic discipline with professional fighting. They were not simply volunteer knights passing through on pilgrimage. They were permanent organizations with networks, property, and a long-term role in defending roads, fortresses, and pilgrims. Their rise changed the balance of power in the Crusader states by providing trained manpower that did not vanish when a crusade ended. Over time, they would become some of the most effective fighting forces in the region and major political actors in their own right. By the second decade of the 12th century, the kingdom passed to a new ruler whose reign was marked by crisis and recovery. In the north, Antioch suffered one of its darkest defeats, when an army was annihilated in a battle remembered for its bloodshed and shock. The victory did not translate into long-term Muslim domination of the region, because the Crusader states responded quickly and managed to stabilize the front. Meanwhile, church and monarchy worked to impose clearer rules of governance, attempting to bring order to a frontier society built from conquest, migration, and constant war. Venice entered the story more aggressively in these years, not only as a trading power, but as a naval force capable of decisive siege warfare along the coast. The capture of key ports strengthened the kingdom's economic lifeline and improved its ability to receive reinforcements from Europe. Yet success came with setbacks as well. Kings and counts were captured during raids, held in harsh fortresses, and released only after painful negotiations that involved fortresses, money, and high-value hostages. Even daughters and heirs could become security for a bargain, a reminder that dynastic survival was constantly entangled with military fortune. In the late 1120s, Crusader forces even attempted to strike at Damascus, one of the most important cities of the region, but the campaign stalled short of its goal. The failure showed the limits of Crusader reach. While the Latin states could seize coastlines and defend strongholds, taking major inland capitals required unity, supplies, and a margin of strength they rarely possessed. Leadership in Jerusalem shifted again with a new royal partnership. Court politics now mattered as much as frontier war. Internal rivalries flared, and the northern Crusader states resisted any attempt to place them fully under Jerusalem's authority. In Antioch, succession crises opened the door to outside manipulation, and the region became a chessboard where marriage alliances, exiles, and sudden coups decided who held power behind the walls. Meanwhile, Byzantium reasserted itself. A new emperor marched with strength, pressed claims over Cilicia and Antioch, and forced local rulers into uneasy agreements. Joint operations against Muslim targets took place, but cooperation was fragile, undercut by suspicion and conflicting objectives. The Byzantine emperor's death soon after one major campaign removed a restraining force from the region, and that vacuum would matter. The most dangerous development of all was the rise of a single Muslim war leader who aimed to unify Syria and Iraq into a stronger front against the Latin states. He built authority first in Mosul and then in Aleppo, using the politics of succession and civil conflict to expand his reach. Unlike many earlier commanders, he pursued a broader strategy, consolidating power, pressing the Crusader frontiers and seeking to reshape the balance of the region. He captured towns, defeated Crusader armies, and forced the kingdom to fight defensively. Then came the blow that changed everything. The weakest Crusader state, Edessa, stood exposed. Its count marched away with an army to pursue alliances elsewhere, leaving the city with limited manpower. The rising Muslim leader moved quickly, surrounded Edessa, and brought siege technology and mining operations against its walls. The defenders were not prepared for the full scale of the attack and lacked techniques to counter the undermining of fortifications. When the wall finally collapsed, the city fell in a rush of terror and violence. Many died in the chaos, including church leaders, and the Latin elite suffered executions and mass loss. Local Christian communities were treated differently than the Western conquerors, but the overall result was unmistakable. One of the 4 Crusader states had been erased. Edessa had been the earliest Latin state founded in the Eastern Mediterranean, and it became the first to collapse. The shock of its loss hit Jerusalem like a cold wave, and the news that reached Western Europe cut through the triumphal mood left over from the first expedition. The victory of 1099 no longer looked like the beginning of a permanent Christian return. It looked like a fragile foothold that could break. Appeals for another major campaign began almost immediately, and this time the response was meant to be more controlled, better supplied, and led from the top. In many ways, it marked a turning point. It was the first large crusading movement to feature reigning monarchs at the head of armies. But the gap between the ambition of the plan and the reality of the journey would prove enormous, and the consequences of failure would be felt for decades. After the fall of Edessa, the political landscape of Syria shifted quickly. The Turkish ruler who had captured the city did not immediately advance on Antioch, as many feared, because unrest elsewhere forced him to withdraw. Soon after, he was assassinated, and power passed to his successor in Aleppo, a far more determined and dangerous leader. The Crusaders briefly retook Edessa through a daring surprise attack, but the citadel held out. A swift counter-offensive followed. The city was recaptured, and its population suffered massacre and enslavement. The destruction of Edessa became a symbol of the rising strength of the Zengid dynasty. In Europe, the papacy answered with a call for a new crusade. Preachers stirred enthusiasm, though their message also fueled outbreaks of violence against Jewish communities, until church leaders intervened. The kings of France and Germany both took the cross, promising a powerful expedition. Yet the campaign soon revealed deep divisions. The German army clashed with Byzantine authorities, crossed into Anatolia without adequate support, and was devastated by Turkish forces. The French followed, but disease, hunger, and relentless attacks weakened them long before they reached Syria. Once in the Holy Land, the Crusaders abandoned the original goal of retaking Edessa, and instead targeted Damascus. The siege collapsed after only a few days due to poor coordination and the arrival of Muslim relief forces. The failure destroyed trust between local settlers and newly arrived Crusaders, leaving lasting bitterness and strengthening Muslim resolve. While the main crusade faltered, parallel campaigns achieved mixed results elsewhere. In Iberia, Christian forces captured key cities from Muslim rulers, while in northern Europe an expedition against pagan tribes gained territory, but few converts. Meanwhile in Syria, the Zengid leader consolidated power, defeating Antioch's army and expanding his control. His successors increasingly focused on Egypt, recognizing that control of the Nile would determine the fate of the region. By the 1170s, a new figure emerged, Saladin. Rising from service under the Zengids, he became ruler of Egypt and gradually united Syria and Egypt under his authority. Early setbacks showed that the Crusaders could still resist, but internal divisions within Jerusalem weakened their position. In 1187, Saladin lured the kingdom's main army into a waterless landscape and destroyed it at the Battle of Hattin. Jerusalem surrendered soon after, shocking Europe and prompting the Third Crusade. The response brought the kings of England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire eastward. The German emperor died on the march, and his army dissolved. The English and French reached Acre, captured it after a brutal siege, and advanced down the coast. Richard of England defeated Saladin at Arsuf but could not secure Jerusalem. After years of fighting and negotiation, a treaty allowed Christian pilgrims access to the Holy City while leaving it under Muslim control. Later, Crusades shifted focus to Egypt and even Constantinople, where a diverted expedition sacked the Byzantine capital and created a fragile Latin empire. In the 13th century, Mongol invasions and the rise of the Mamluks transformed the region again. Gradually, the Crusader states shrank to coastal enclaves. Acre, the last major stronghold, fell in 1291, ending 2 centuries of Latin presence in the mainland Holy Land. Beyond warfare, the Crusades reshaped societies. Military orders created permanent forces, castles blended Eastern and Western styles, and Mediterranean trade expanded through Italian ports. The movement left deep cultural memories that later generations would reinterpret for their own politics. What began as a religious pilgrimage had become a long and complex struggle that altered Europe and the Middle East alike.